Officer Marcus Thompson had been working the graveyard shift in Millfield, Ohio for 8 years, and he thought he'd seen everything a small Midwestern town could throw at him. Domestic disputes, drunk and disorderly conduct, the occasional break-in at the hardware store. Nothing that would make headlines or haunt his dreams. But on the night of March 14th, 2019, at exactly 2:47 a.m., dispatch would send him to 1247 Elm Street for what seemed like the most routine call of his career. A welfare check on an elderly resident. The call had come in from Jessica Hartman, a 34-year-old nurse who lived next door to 82-year-old Dorothy Kellerman. Jessica had worked a double shift at Millfield General Hospital and arrived home around 2:30 a.m. to find something that immediately concerned her. Mrs. Kellerman's house, which was usually dark by 9 p.m. every night, was blazing with lights in every window. Not just the usual living room lamp that Dorothy kept on for security, but every single light in the 2-story colonial home. "I've lived next to Mrs. Kellerman for 6 years," Jessica told the dispatcher, her voice carrying the exhaustion of a long shift mixed with genuine worry. "She's incredibly consistent with her routine. Lights out by 9 p.m., up at 6 a.m. to tend her garden. She's never had all her lights on like this, especially not at this hour. I knocked on her door, but there's no answer. Her car's in the driveway, and I can hear what sounds like her television playing loudly upstairs." Officer Thompson had responded to welfare checks before, and they typically fell into one of 3 categories. False alarms, where elderly residents had simply fallen asleep in front of the TV, medical emergencies requiring immediate ambulance dispatch, or the grim discovery of natural deaths. At 82, Dorothy Kellerman was at an age where any of these scenarios was possible. Thompson expected to find either a confused elderly woman who had forgotten to turn off her lights, or, unfortunately, someone who had passed away peacefully in her sleep. As Thompson pulled up to 1247 Elm Street, the scene was exactly as Jessica had described. The modest 2-story home looked like a Christmas display, with warm yellow light pouring from every visible window. The contrast with the dark, sleeping neighborhood around it was stark and unsettling. Mrs. Kellerman's 2003 Honda Civic sat in the narrow driveway, positioned as neatly as always. Thompson had driven past this house hundreds of times during his patrols, and Dorothy Kellerman was known throughout the neighborhood as a meticulous woman who kept everything in perfect order. Thompson approached the front door, noting that the porch light was on and the morning newspaper still lay on the welcome mat. Through the large front window he could see into the living room, which appeared normal except for being unusually bright. The furniture was arranged as it always had been. A floral print sofa facing an old console television, a recliner positioned at the perfect angle for reading, and side tables covered with the kind of lace doilies that had gone out of style decades ago. He rang the doorbell and waited, listening for movement inside the house. From where he stood, he could indeed hear television sounds, but they seemed to be coming from the second floor, which struck him as odd. In his experience, elderly residents typically spent their evening hours in ground-floor living spaces, finding it easier than navigating stairs multiple times per day. The volume was loud enough that if Mrs. Kellerman was upstairs watching TV, she should have heard the doorbell. After waiting a full minute, Thompson rang the doorbell again and followed up with firm knocks on the door. "Mrs. Kellerman, this is Officer Thompson with the Millfield Police Department. I'm here to check on your welfare. Can you please come to the door?" His voice carried clearly in the quiet night air, and he paused to listen for any response. Nothing. Thompson walked around to the back of the house, following a narrow path between Dorothy's property and Jessica's. The backyard was as neat as the front, with a small vegetable garden that had been prepared for spring planting, and a bird feeder hanging from an oak tree that had to be 50 years old. The back door was solid wood with no window, but Thompson could see that the kitchen lights were on through a small window beside it. He knocked on the back door and called out again, with the same result. By this point, Thompson's routine welfare check was beginning to feel different. The combination of all lights being on, the loud television upstairs, and Mrs. Kellerman's complete failure to respond suggested something was wrong. In his 8 years of experience, elderly residents who were simply sleeping or had fallen asleep watching TV would typically wake up when police knocked loudly and called their names. The complete silence from inside the house, despite clear evidence that someone was home, was concerning. Thompson returned to his patrol car and radioed dispatch. Unit 247 to dispatch. I'm at 1247 Elm Street for the welfare check. No response from the resident, but all lights are on and I can hear television sounds from the second floor. The subject's vehicle is in the driveway. Requesting permission to make entry for welfare purposes. Dispatch confirmed the request and reminded Thompson to document his observations carefully. Welfare check entries, while necessary for public safety, required thorough documentation to protect both the officer and the department from potential liability issues. Thompson retrieved his flashlight and notebook, though the bright lights from every window of the house made the flashlight seem unnecessary. The front door was locked, but Thompson's examination of the windows revealed that one of the living room windows was unlocked. Not unusual for an elderly resident who might have opened it for fresh air and forgotten to secure it. Thompson carefully opened the window and climbed through, immediately calling out his presence and purpose. Mrs. Kellerman, this is Officer Thompson with the Millfield Police. I've entered your home to check on your welfare. Please respond if you can hear me. The inside of the house felt wrong immediately, though Thompson couldn't initially identify why. The living room looked exactly as it had from outside, neat, orderly, and undisturbed. But there was something in the air, a smell that he couldn't quite place. Not the musty odor of an elderly person's home, not the smell of death that he'd encountered before, but something else entirely. Something chemical or medicinal, mixed with an underlying sweetness that made him slightly nauseated. Thompson moved through the ground floor systematically, checking each room and calling out for Mrs. Kellerman. The dining room was pristine, with a table set for one, and what appeared to be the remnants of an evening meal still on the plate. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans, barely touched and now cold. A glass of milk sat beside the plate, with a thin film on top suggesting it had been sitting for several hours. The kitchen was where Thompson first noticed something that made him pause. Every cabinet door was open, not wide open, but just slightly ajar, as if someone had opened each one just enough to peer inside and then left them that way. The refrigerator door was also slightly open, causing the interior light to stay on and the motor to run continuously. Inside, Thompson could see that the contents were perfectly organized. Jars and containers arranged with military precision, labels facing forward, everything in its designated place. But it was what wasn't in the refrigerator that struck Thompson as odd. For an 82-year-old woman living alone, Dorothy's refrigerator contained almost nothing in the way of typical leftovers or prepared foods. Instead, the shelves were filled with dozens of small glass jars, each containing what appeared to be different colored liquids or powders. Some were labeled with handwritten tags, but the writing was too small and cramped for Thompson to read in the refrigerator's dim light. Thompson called out again for Mrs. Kellerman, and this time he thought he heard something. From upstairs. Not a response, but a sound like movement or perhaps something falling. The television sounds were definitely coming from the second floor, and they seemed louder now that he was inside the house. It wasn't the familiar sound of regular programming, but something repetitive, like the same segment playing over and over again. As Thompson approached the staircase, The chemical smell became stronger. The stairs themselves were carpeted with a floral pattern that had seen better days, but they were clean and well maintained. Each step creaked slightly under his weight, the sounds unnaturally loud in the otherwise silent house. The handrail was worn smooth from years of use, and Thompson noticed that it was slightly sticky to the touch, as if it had been coated with some kind of substance. Halfway up the stairs, Thompson could see that the hallway at the top was brightly lit, with what appeared to be every door standing open. The television sounds were coming from a room at the end of the hall, and there was now no doubt that it was the same audio segment repeating continuously. The sound was tinny and distorted, as if it was being played through an old speaker or at an unnaturally loud volume. "Mrs. Kellerman, I'm coming upstairs to check on you. Please respond if you can hear me." Thompson's voice echoed in the stairwell, but again there was no response from the elderly woman. At the top of the stairs, Thompson found himself in a hallway that ran the length of the house, with 4 doors opening off it. 3 of the doors led to what appeared to be bedrooms, while the 4th was clearly a bathroom. The smell was much stronger here, almost overwhelming, and Thompson had to breathe through his mouth to avoid gagging. It was definitely chemical now, like cleaning supplies mixed with something organic that he didn't want to identify. Thompson approached the first bedroom, which appeared to be set up as a guest room. The lights were on, and the room looked normal except for one disturbing detail. The bed was made, but it was made wrong. The pillows were arranged at the foot of the bed instead of the head, and the comforter was pulled up backward, with the decorative pattern facing down instead of up. It was as if someone had made the bed while standing at the wrong end, or as if they had never seen a properly made bed before. The second bedroom was clearly Mrs. Kellerman's primary bedroom, and here Thompson found the first truly disturbing evidence that something was seriously wrong. The room was brightly lit like all the others, and at first glance it appeared normal. But when Thompson looked more closely, he realized that every piece of furniture had been moved, not rearranged, moved exactly 3 feet to the left of where it had originally stood. The bed, the dresser, the nightstand, even a small chair in the corner had all been shifted in perfect alignment, leaving indentations in the carpet where they had originally been placed. On the nightstand, which now sat in the middle of what should have been empty floor space, was a collection of prescription bottles. Thompson counted 14 different medications, all prescribed to Dorothy Kellerman, all dated within the past month. But what caught his attention was that several of the bottles were empty, despite being filled only days earlier according to the pharmacy labels. The repetitive television sounds were coming from the final room at the end of the hall. As Thompson approached, he could now make out what was playing. It was the same 30-second segment of what sounded like a children's educational program, playing over and over. The volume was turned up so high that the speaker was distorting, creating a harsh mechanical sound that was almost painful to listen to. Thompson pushed open the door to the final room and immediately understood why Mrs. Kellerman hadn't been answering his calls. The room, which appeared to be a small den or study, contained Dorothy Kellerman, but she was not in any condition to respond to anyone. Mrs. Kellerman was sitting in a wooden chair in the center of the room, facing an old television that was indeed playing the same segment repeatedly. She was dressed in her nightgown and robe, as if she had been preparing for bed, but something was horribly wrong with her appearance. Her eyes were wide open, staring directly at the television screen, but they had a glassy, unfocused quality that Thompson recognized from other medical emergencies. Thompson immediately called for an ambulance and approached Mrs. Kellerman carefully. She was alive. He could see her chest rising and falling slowly, but she was completely unresponsive. When Thompson checked her pulse, it was weak and irregular. Her skin felt cold and clammy. and there was a strange, sweet smell coming from her breath that added to the chemical odor that permeated the house. "Mrs. Kellerman, can you hear me? I'm Officer Thompson, and I'm here to help you." Thompson gently shook her shoulder, but there was no response. Her eyes didn't track his movement, and she showed no awareness of his presence whatsoever. As Thompson waited for the ambulance to arrive, he began to notice other disturbing details about the room. The television was playing the same educational segment, something about shapes and colors clearly intended for very young children, but it was playing from an old VHS tape. The tape player was set to repeat continuously, and based on the wear on the tape and the distortion in the audio, it had been playing for many hours, possibly all night. Around Mrs. Kellerman's chair, Thompson found evidence that she had been in this position for an extended period. There was a small puddle of urine beneath the chair, and her legs showed signs of swelling consistent with sitting in one position for hours. Most disturbing was what appeared to be vomit down the front of her nightgown, dried and crusty, suggesting she had been sick at some point during the night but had remained in the chair. On a small table beside Mrs. Kellerman's chair was a glass of what appeared to be milk, similar to the one Thompson had found in the dining room. But this glass was empty except for a residue at the bottom that looked different from regular milk. It was thicker and had a slightly yellowish color, and the smell coming from the glass added to the chemical odor that was making Thompson feel increasingly nauseated. The ambulance arrived within 10 minutes, and EMT Sarah Williams and her partner, Derek Martinez, immediately began assessing Mrs. Kellerman's condition. Williams, who had been working emergency medical services in Millfield for 12 years, later told Thompson that she had never seen anything quite like Dorothy Kellerman's condition. "She's alive, and her vital signs are stable, but she's in some kind of catatonic state," Williams explained as she and Martinez prepared Mrs. Kellerman for transport. "Her pupils are extremely dilated and non-reactive, which suggests some kind of drug intoxication, but her breathing and heart rate don't match any overdose patterns I'm familiar with. We need to get her to the hospital immediately for blood work and evaluation." As the EMTs carried Mrs. Kellerman downstairs and out to the ambulance, Thompson began the process of securing the scene and documenting what he had found. The house would need to be processed as a potential crime scene, given the evidence of possible poisoning or drugging, but Thompson's initial responsibility was to ensure that no evidence was disturbed and to begin documenting the strange conditions he had discovered. Thompson called his supervisor, Sergeant Patricia Hayes, to report the situation. Hayes, a 20-year veteran of the Millfield Police Department, recognized immediately that this was not a routine welfare check. "Marcus, I want you to secure that house and don't let anyone else inside until we can get a detective out there," Hayes instructed. "What you're describing sounds like either an attempted murder or some kind of elder abuse situation. Don't touch anything else and start documenting everything exactly as you found it." As Thompson waited for the detective to arrive, he stood outside Mrs. Kellerman's house and looked back at the brightly lit windows. In his 8 years of police work, he had developed good instincts about when situations were routine and when they were something more serious. Everything about Dorothy Kellerman's house felt wrong. From the furniture moved exactly 3 feet to the left, to the cabinet doors left ajar, to the repetitive children's program playing at painful volume, while an elderly woman sat catatonic in front of it. But what bothered Thompson most was the realization that someone had been in that house with Mrs. Kellerman. Someone had moved the furniture, opened the cabinet doors, set up the television to play the same segment over and over. Someone had given her whatever was in that glass that had left her in a catatonic state. And based on the evidence that someone had done all of this methodically, deliberately, and had then left Mrs. Kellerman to sit in that chair for hours, staring at a children's program while her mind was trapped somewhere else entirely. Thompson looked at his watch. It was now 4:15 a.m., and Detective Amanda Russell would arrive within the hour to begin what Thompson suspected would be a much more complex investigation than anyone had anticipated. As he stood guard outside Dorothy Kellerman's house, watching the lights blaze from every window, Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that what he had discovered was only the beginning of something much darker and more disturbing than a simple welfare check gone wrong. Detective Amanda Russell arrived at 1247 Elm Street at 4:52 a.m., having been pulled from her bed by Sergeant Hayes's urgent phone call. Russell had been with the Millfield Police Department for 15 years, the last 8 as a detective specializing in elder abuse and domestic violence cases. She had seen her share of disturbing situations, but as Officer Thompson briefed her on what he had discovered inside Dorothy Kellerman's house, she felt the familiar knot of dread that always accompanied cases that started simple and quickly revealed themselves to be anything but. "Walk me through exactly what you found, Marcus, and don't leave out any details, no matter how minor they seem," Russell said, as she pulled on latex gloves and prepared to enter the house. Thompson's initial report had been thorough, but Russell knew that crime scenes often revealed additional evidence upon closer examination, particularly when the first responder had been focused on the immediate medical emergency. Thompson led Russell through the same path he had taken, through the unlocked living room window, past the undisturbed dining room with its abandoned meal, and into the kitchen with its precisely arranged refrigerator contents and mysteriously opened cabinet doors. Russell photographed everything with her digital camera, paying particular attention to the small glass jars in the refrigerator. "Did you get a close look at the labels on these jars?" Russell asked, carefully removing one from the refrigerator to examine it in better light. The jar contained a yellowish powder, and the handwritten label read, "DK, Evening, March 10th, 1919. The date was just 4 days ago." Thompson shook his head. "I saw them, but couldn't make out the writing in the dim light. What do you think they are?" Russell examined several more jars, finding similar labels with different dates, all within the past month. Some contained powders in various colors: white, yellow, pale blue, while others held liquids that ranged from clear to amber to an unsettling reddish-brown. All were labeled with DK, followed by either morning, afternoon, or evening, and a recent date. "These look like they could be medications that have been ground up or dissolved," Russell said, carefully photographing each jar before returning it to the refrigerator. "But I've never seen anything like this organized storage system for prescription drugs. We'll need to have these analyzed, along with that glass you found upstairs." As they moved through the house, Russell began to notice details that Thompson had missed during his initial emergency response. In the living room, she found that all the picture frames on the side tables had been turned face down. When she carefully turned them over, she discovered family photos spanning several decades. Dorothy, as a young woman, with her late husband Robert, their daughter Michelle at various ages from childhood through adulthood, and more recent photos of what appeared to be grandchildren. "Officer Thompson, did you mention whether Mrs. Kellerman has any living family members?" Russell asked as she photographed the overturned frames. "I don't have that information yet, but I can check with dispatch." "Why?" Russell pointed to the most recent family photo, which showed Dorothy with a woman in her 50s and 2 teenagers. "If she has family, particularly local family, we need to know why they weren't the ones checking on her welfare. And we need to know if anyone else has had access to this house recently." Upstairs, Russell spent considerable time in the room where Thompson had found Mrs. Kellerman. The scene was even more disturbing in the full light of her camera flash. The wooden chair where Dorothy had been sitting was positioned exactly in the center of the room, equidistant from all 4 walls. The television had been moved from its original position against one wall to directly face the chair, with the VHS player connected by extension cords that created a perfect straight line between the devices and the chair. Russell ejected the VHS tape and examined it. The label read, "Learning Shapes and Colors, ages 2 to 4, in cheerful, child-friendly lettering." It was a commercial educational video, the kind typically used in daycare centers or preschools. The tape itself showed signs of excessive wear, with stretched sections that indicated it had been played repeatedly. "Marcus, this setup is incredibly deliberate," Russell said as she photographed the room from multiple angles. "Someone wanted Mrs. Kellerman in that specific chair, watching that specific program for an extended period of time. This isn't random or impulsive. This is calculated." In the bedroom, with the moved furniture, Russell made a discovery that sent chills down her spine. Using a tape measure from her evidence kit, she confirmed that every piece of furniture had been moved exactly 3 feet and 2 inches to the left of its original position. The precision was unsettling. Not the kind of approximate measurement someone might make while rearranging a room, but an exact distance that had been carefully calculated and executed. More disturbing was what Russell found when she examined the carpet indentations where the furniture had originally been positioned. Each indentation contained a small pile of what appeared to be white powder, carefully arranged in a perfect circle. Russell photographed the powder and carefully collected samples from each location for analysis. In the master bedroom's walk-in closet, Russell discovered evidence that someone had been systematically going through Dorothy's belongings. All of her clothing had been removed from hangers and then rehung, but in reverse order: summer clothes where winter clothes should be, casual wear mixed with formal wear in a pattern that made no sense for someone who lived alone and dressed herself daily. More importantly, Russell found a shoebox hidden behind the reorganized clothes that contained documents Dorothy had apparently been trying to keep secure. The box held Dorothy's will, life insurance policies, banking information, and a series of increasingly frantic handwritten notes dated over the past 3 weeks. The notes, written in Dorothy's shaking handwriting, told a story that made Russell's blood run cold. March 1st, Michelle came by again today. Says she's worried about me living alone. Asked about my medications and wanted to know where I keep my important papers. March 5th, found my kitchen cabinets open when I woke up. Michelle says I probably forgot to close them, but I know I didn't. She stayed for dinner and made me a glass of milk. Felt very sleepy afterward. March 8th, Michelle has been coming every few days now. She brings her own food and insists on making my drinks. I've been feeling confused after her visits. Can't remember conversations we had. March 12th. I think Michelle is putting something in my food or drinks. When I told her I didn't want her to visit anymore, she got very angry. Said I was being ungrateful and that she was trying to help me. March 13th. Hid this box so Michelle can't find it. If something happens to me, I want people to know that Michelle has been giving me things that make me feel sick and confused. She's been asking about my will and my bank accounts. I'm scared of my own daughter. Russell felt a wave of nausea as she read the final entry, dated just the day before Thompson's welfare check. March 13th. Michelle came tonight even though I told her not to. She had a new video she wanted me to watch. Said it would help me relax. I don't want to watch it, but she's making me sit in the chair upstairs. She gave me something to drink that tastes wrong. I feel very strange. If anyone finds this, please know that I love my daughter, but I think she's trying to. The handwriting trailed off, with the pen mark dragging across the paper, as if Dorothy had lost consciousness while writing. Russell immediately radioed for backup and called Sergeant Hayes. I need to speak with the hospital about Mrs. Kellerman's condition, and I need you to run a check on her daughter Michelle. we're looking at a possible poisoning case, and the victim left behind evidence that her daughter has been systematically drugging her. While waiting for backup to arrive, Russell continued her examination of the house and made several more disturbing discoveries. In a drawer in the kitchen, she found a collection of syringes and small bottles that appeared to contain liquid medications. Some of the bottles were labeled with prescription information for Dorothy Kellerman, but others had no labels at all. Several of the syringes showed residue that suggested they had been used recently. In the basement, Russell found evidence that someone had been living in the house periodically without Dorothy's knowledge. A small area behind the furnace had been set up with a sleeping bag, a change of clothes, and several books about medication interactions and drug effects. Most chilling was a notebook containing detailed observations about Dorothy's reactions to different substances, written in a neat handwriting that was clearly not Dorothy's. Subject shows increased compliance when given 50 milligram compound in evening milk. Remains conscious but suggestible for approximately 4 to 6 hours. Higher doses, 75 milligrams, produce catatonic state lasting 8 to 12 hours. Subject remains physically stable but completely unresponsive. Combination with video repetition appears to enhance dissociative effects. Subject fixates on screen and becomes completely unaware of surroundings. Russell photographed every page of the notebook, recognizing that she was looking at evidence of systematic psychological and physical abuse that had been carefully planned and executed over weeks or possibly months. The clinical nature of the observations, combined with the precise measurements and calculated effects, suggested someone with medical knowledge or access to medical resources. At 6:30 a.m., backup officers Kyle Martinez and Brandon Foster arrived to help secure the scene and begin processing evidence. Russell briefed them on her findings and assigned Martinez to continue photographing and cataloging evidence, while Foster began the process of tracking down Michelle Kellerman's current address and whereabouts. This is one of the most methodical cases of elder abuse I've ever encountered, Russell explained to the officers. We're dealing with someone who's been systematically poisoning and psychologically torturing an elderly woman, documenting the effects, and apparently escalating the abuse over time. The call from Millfield General Hospital came at 7:15 a.m. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the emergency room physician treating Dorothy Kellerman, had disturbing news. Detective Russell, Mrs. Kellerman's blood work shows extremely high levels of multiple psychoactive drugs, including benzodiazepines, antipsychotics, and what appears to be a veterinary sedative called xylazine. The combination and dosages should have killed her. The fact that she's alive is frankly miraculous. We also found evidence of chronic poisoning, suggesting this has been going on for an extended period. Dr. Walsh continued with information that made Russell's investigation even more urgent. The most concerning finding is that several of the drugs in her system are not medications that would typically be prescribed to someone of her age and medical condition. Someone with access to medical supplies has been systematically drugging this woman with substances that would render her helpless and compliant. Russell asked the crucial question, "Doctor, has anyone been to the hospital asking about Mrs. Kellerman's condition? Any family members or visitors?" Actually, yes. A woman claiming to be her daughter Michelle came in around 6 a.m., about an hour after Mrs. Kellerman was admitted. She seemed very concerned and asked detailed questions about her mother's condition and prognosis. She also asked about when Mrs. Kellerman might be released and whether she would need home care. Russell felt her pulse quicken. "Is this woman still there?" "No, she left about 20 minutes ago. She said she needed to go home and get some things to bring to her mother, but she seemed eager to leave when I started asking about Mrs. Kellerman's medical history and recent medications." Russell immediately put out a BOLO alert for Michelle Kellerman, requesting that all units be on the lookout for a woman in her 50s who might be driving to or from the hospital area. Based on Dorothy's notes and the evidence found in the house, Michelle was now the primary suspect in what appeared to be an attempted murder case disguised as elder care. Officer Foster's background check on Michelle Kellerman revealed information that added crucial context to the investigation. Michelle Kellerman, age 54, was Dorothy's only child and had been employed as a certified nursing assistant at various healthcare facilities over the past 15 years. More importantly, she had been terminated from her most recent position at a nursing home in nearby Springfield just 6 weeks earlier, following allegations that she had been stealing medications from the facility's pharmacy. The termination report, which Foster obtained from the nursing home's administrator, painted a picture of someone who had become increasingly erratic and possessive toward elderly patients under her care. Michelle had been caught on surveillance cameras entering patient rooms during off hours and had been found in possession of medications that had not been prescribed to her assigned patients. The really disturbing part, the administrator told Foster over the phone, was that she seemed to be experimenting with different drug combinations. We found notes in her locker about how different medications affected different patients' behavior and cognitive function. It was like she was treating the residents as test subjects. Russell realized that Michelle Kellerman had been using her medical knowledge and access to drugs to systematically abuse her own mother, possibly as practice or experimentation for more extensive elder abuse. The precision of the drug combinations, the careful documentation of effects, and the psychological torture elements suggested someone who was refining techniques that could potentially be used on other vulnerable, elderly individuals. At 8:45 a.m., Russell received the call she had been dreading. Officer Martinez, who had been dispatched to Michelle Kellerman's registered address, reported that the apartment was empty but showed signs of hasty departure. Clothes were scattered throughout the bedroom, and the bathroom contained evidence that someone had recently dyed their hair and possibly changed their appearance. More disturbing was what Martinez found in Michelle's apartment that directly connected her to the abuse of her mother. The kitchen contained a setup identical to what Russell had found in Dorothy's house, dozens of small jars containing various powdered and liquid substances, each labeled with dates and dosage information. A notebook on the kitchen counter contained detailed plans for what Michelle called the final protocol, a series of drug administrations that would apparently render Dorothy completely catatonic for an extended period. The final entry in Michelle's notebook, dated the morning of the welfare check, revealed the full extent of her intentions. Mother is becoming too suspicious and resistant. The final protocol will need to be implemented tonight. Once she is in a completely dissociative state, I can maintain her on minimal life support while I handle the legal and financial arrangements. The video programming has been very effective in keeping her focused and compliant during transitions. Russell realized that Thompson's welfare check had likely interrupted Michelle in the middle of implementing what she intended to be a final, permanent solution. Keeping her mother alive but completely incapacitated while Michelle gained control of her assets and living situation. The children's video playing on repeat had been designed to keep Dorothy's mind occupied while the drugs rendered her unable to resist or call for help. As the morning progressed and more evidence was processed, Russell began to understand that she was dealing with a sophisticated and premeditated case of elder abuse that could have easily resulted in Dorothy Kellerman's death. Michelle had used her medical training and access to drugs to systematically torture and control her mother, documenting the process with the clinical detachment of someone who viewed her victim as a test subject rather than a human being. But Michelle Kellerman was now in the wind, possibly with enough medical knowledge and drugs to target other elderly victims. Russell knew that finding Michelle before she could relocate and start over with a new victim had become a race against time. The welfare check that had started as a routine call was now a manhunt for someone who had turned elder care into a calculated form of torture. By 10:30 a.m., Detective Russell had transformed the investigation from a single welfare check into a multi-agency manhunt. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation had been notified, and alerts had been sent to police departments throughout the tri-state area. Michelle Kellerman's photo description and vehicle information were distributed to every law enforcement agency within a 200-mile radius, along with warnings that she should be considered dangerous and potentially armed with controlled substances. Russell's phone rang at 11:15 a.m. with news that made her stomach drop. Officer Derek Austin from the Springfield Police Department was calling about a welfare check they had conducted 3 days earlier, a check that now seemed disturbingly relevant to the Kellerman case. "Detective Russell, we got your BOLO alert about Michelle Kellerman, and I need to tell you about something that happened here on March 11th, Austin said, his voice tight with concern. "We did a welfare check on an 89-year-old woman named Margaret Foster. Her nephew had called because she hadn't answered her phone in 2 days. When we got to her house, we found her sitting in her living room chair, completely unresponsive, staring at a television that was playing the same children's program over and over." Russell felt ice in her veins. What was her condition? She was alive, but completely catatonic, just like you described with Mrs. Kellerman. The house was set up almost exactly the way you described. All the lights on, furniture moved around, and we found evidence that someone had been giving her substances that weren't her normal medications. She's still in the hospital, and the doctors say she may never fully recover from whatever was done to her. Austin continued with information that confirmed Russell's worst fears. "The thing is, we found a business card in Mrs. Foster's house for a home health aid service. The card had the name Michelle Kelly on it, but when we tried to contact the service, we found out it was fake. No such company exists." Russell immediately requested that Springfield PD send her all evidence and documentation from the Foster case. As she waited for the files to arrive, she began to piece together a pattern that suggested Michelle Kellerman had been operating for months, possibly years, targeting elderly individuals throughout the region under various assumed names. Officer Martinez, who had been reviewing Michelle's employment history, provided additional pieces of the puzzle. "Detective, I've been calling the nursing homes and care facilities where Michelle worked over the past 5 years. 3 different facilities reported unexplained incidents involving elderly residents who became suddenly ill or exhibited unusual behavioral changes during Michelle's employment periods. The most disturbing report came from Sunset Manor in Columbus, where Michelle had worked 18 months earlier." The facility's director, Patricia Wilkinson, told Martinez about a cluster of incidents that had baffled the medical staff at the time. "We had 4 residents over the course of 6 weeks who developed what appeared to be early-stage dementia symptoms, confusion, disorientation, periods of complete unresponsiveness," Wilkinson explained. But these were residents who had been cognitively sharp just weeks earlier. The symptoms came on suddenly and progressed rapidly. What made the incidents even more suspicious was that all 4 residents had been under Michelle's care, and all had shown improvement after Michelle left her position at the facility. "Looking back now, with what you're telling me, I think Michelle was using our residents as test subjects for whatever she was planning to do to her mother." Russell realized she was dealing with a serial elder abuser who had been refining her methods for years before targeting her own mother. The precision and clinical nature of the abuse Dorothy had suffered made sense now. Michelle had been practicing on vulnerable elderly strangers, perfecting her techniques for psychological and pharmaceutical torture. At 1:45 p.m., Russell received a call that changed the direction of the investigation entirely. Dr. Walsh from Millfield General called with an update on Dorothy Kellerman's condition that included disturbing new information. Detective: Mrs. Kellerman regained consciousness about an hour ago, and she's been able to provide some information about what her daughter did to her. But there's something else. Something that makes this case even more urgent than we realized. Dr. Walsh's voice carried a gravity that made Russell brace for bad news. Mrs. Kellerman says that Michelle wasn't working alone. She mentioned a man who came to the house with Michelle on several occasions, someone Michelle referred to as her research partner. According to Mrs. Kellerman, this man was the one who suggested many of the drug combinations and psychological techniques that Michelle used. Russell felt the case expanding beyond what she had imagined. Did Mrs. Kellerman provide any description of this man? She's still very confused and her memory is fragmented, but she remembers that he was younger than Michelle, maybe in his 30s, and that he carried a medical bag. She said he talked about her like she was a specimen, discussing dosages and effects as if she wasn't even there. Most importantly, she heard Michelle and this man discussing other subjects they were working with. This meant Michelle Kellerman wasn't just a lone elder abuser. She was part of a larger operation that was systematically targeting vulnerable elderly individuals across multiple jurisdictions. Russell immediately contacted the FBI's Cincinnati field office to request assistance with what was now clearly a multi-state criminal enterprise. The breakthrough came at 3:20 p.m. when Officer Jennifer Coleman from the Dayton Police Department called with urgent information. Coleman had been investigating a missing person report filed that morning by the daughter of 76-year-old Harold Chen, who lived alone in a suburb outside Dayton. The daughter went to check on her father this morning and found his house empty, but there were signs that someone had been living there recently, Coleman explained. We found the same setup you described: opened cabinets, moved furniture, and evidence of someone administering unknown substances. But here's the important part. A neighbor saw a woman matching Michelle Kellerman's description leaving the house around 8 a.m. this morning with an older man and what appeared to be Mr. Chen, who seemed barely conscious. Coleman had more crucial information. The neighbor got a partial license plate on their vehicle, a dark blue sedan with Ohio plates starting with HJK. We've got units searching the area, but they had at least a 7-hour head start. Russell immediately put out an updated BOLO alert with the vehicle information and expanded the search to include Harold Chen as a kidnapping victim. The case had now escalated from elder abuse to potential kidnapping and interstate transportation of victims for criminal purposes. At 4:15 p.m., the FBI task force arrived in Millfield, led by Special Agent Tyler Morrison. Morrison, who specialized in organized elder abuse and healthcare fraud, reviewed Russell's evidence and immediately recognized patterns consistent with cases his unit had been tracking across multiple states. What you've uncovered here appears to be part of a much larger operation, Morrison told Russell as they reviewed the evidence spread across the conference room table. We've been tracking similar cases in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky. Elderly individuals who were systematically drugged and psychologically tortured, often by people claiming to be healthcare workers or family caregivers. Morrison's team had been investigating what they called experimental elder abuse, cases where perpetrators appeared to be testing different combinations of drugs and psychological techniques on elderly victims, often documenting the results with scientific precision. The disturbing thing about these cases is that they appear to be coordinated, Morrison explained. The techniques are too similar across different states and different perpetrators for this to be coincidental. We think there's an organized network sharing information about methods and potentially trafficking victims between locations. Russell felt sick as she realized the full scope of what they were dealing with. Michelle Kellerman wasn't just an isolated case of familial elder abuse. She was part of an organized criminal network that was treating elderly people as experimental subjects for systematic torture and exploitation. The next break came from an unexpected source. At 5:45 p.m., Jessica Hartman, the neighbor who had originally called in the welfare check, contacted Russell with information she had initially forgotten to mention. "Detective, I just remembered something that might be important," Jessica said. "About 2 weeks ago, I saw Michelle at her mother's house with a man I didn't recognize. They were carrying what looked like medical equipment into the house. Monitors, IV stands, things like that. I thought at the time that maybe Mrs. Kellerman was getting home health care." Jessica provided a description of the man that matched what Dorothy had told Dr. Walsh. Mid-30s, tall and thin, carrying a medical bag. More importantly, Jessica had noticed something that could help track them down. The man was driving a van with Pennsylvania plates and some kind of medical supply company logo on the side. I couldn't read the whole name, but I remember it had the word CARE in it. Morrison's team immediately began searching databases of medical supply companies in Pennsylvania with CARE in their names. Within an hour, they had identified 3 possibilities and had begun the process of contacting each company to determine if any of their vehicles or employees might be involved in the case. At 7:30 p.m., as Russell was preparing for what looked like it would be a long night of investigation, Officer Austin from Springfield called back with news that made everyone in the room freeze. "Detective Russell, we just found Margaret Foster dead in her hospital room. She was stable this morning, but the nurses found her about an hour ago. The preliminary assessment suggests she was given a massive overdose of the same types of drugs that were in her system when we found her." The implications hit Russell immediately. Officer Austin, who had access to Mrs. Foster's room today? Any visitors or medical personnel who weren't regular hospital staff? That's the thing. A woman claiming to be Mrs. Foster's niece visited her around 2 p.m. The description matches Michelle Kellerman, and security footage shows her leaving the hospital shortly before Mrs. Foster's condition deteriorated. Russell realized that Michelle and her partner weren't just kidnapping new victims. They were eliminating previous victims who might be able to testify against them. Margaret Foster's murder meant that Dorothy Kellerman was also in immediate danger, and anyone else who had survived their previous experiments was now a potential target. The manhunt had become a race not just to capture Michelle Kellerman and her partner, but to prevent them from systematically murdering the elderly victims they had left behind in hospitals and care facilities across multiple states. Russell knew that somewhere out there, Harold Chen was in the hands of people who viewed him as nothing more than a test subject, and who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill to cover their tracks. As night fell on what had started as a routine welfare check, Russell found herself at the center of an investigation that was revealing a network of systematic elder abuse, experimentation, and murder that spanned multiple states and potentially dozens of victims. The lights that had been burning in Dorothy Kellerman's windows the night before had illuminated something far darker than anyone could have imagined. The call that broke the case came at 11:47 p.m. from an unexpected source. Dr. Amanda Stevens, the chief medical examiner for Franklin County, had been reviewing autopsy records from the past 2 years when she noticed a pattern that connected directly to the Kellerman investigation. "Agent Morrison, I've been going through cases of elderly individuals who died under suspicious circumstances in the past 24 months, Dr. Stevens said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been working through disturbing evidence for hours. "I've identified at least 12 cases where the cause of death was initially attributed to natural causes or accidental overdose, but the drug combinations found in their systems are identical to what you've described in the Kellerman case." Morrison put the call on speaker so Russell could hear the details. Dr. Stevens had discovered what she was calling a signature cocktail of drugs that appeared in multiple cases across Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky. The combination was specific and unusual. Veterinary sedatives mixed with antipsychotics and benzodiazepines in precise ratios that would cause maximum psychological incapacitation while keeping the victim technically alive. The most disturbing thing is the progression, Dr. Stevens continued. In the earliest cases from 2 years ago, the drug combinations were cruder, less precise, but as the cases move forward chronologically, they become more sophisticated, more targeted. It's like someone was learning and refining their technique with each victim. Russell felt a chill as she realized they were looking at evidence of a systematic learning process. Michelle and her partner had been perfecting their methods by practicing on elderly victims, treating each death as a learning opportunity rather than a tragedy. Dr. Stevens had more crucial information. I found something else that connects these cases. In every single instance, there were signs that the victim had been subjected to repetitive audio or visual stimuli for extended periods before death. Brain tissue analysis shows patterns consistent with prolonged sensory bombardment, the kind of psychological torture you described finding with Mrs. Kellerman. At 12:30 a.m. on March 15th, the first major break in locating Michelle and her partner came from Pennsylvania State Police. A trooper conducting a routine traffic stop outside Harrisburg had pulled over a dark blue sedan matching the description from the BOLO alert. The vehicle was registered to someone named Michael Torres, and when the trooper ran the plates, he discovered that Torres was a former pharmacy technician who had been fired from 3 different medical facilities for stealing controlled substances. But the vehicle was empty, except for evidence that it had recently been used to transport someone who was heavily sedated. Medical equipment, empty IV bags, and traces of the same drug combinations that had been found in Dorothy Kellerman's system. Russell and Morrison immediately coordinated with Pennsylvania authorities to expand the search around the area where the sedan had been abandoned. Within hours, they had identified a remote facility that Torres had been renting under a false name, a defunct veterinary clinic in rural Pennsylvania that had been closed for 5 years. The Pennsylvania State Police tactical team surrounded the building at 4:20 a.m. What they found inside would haunt everyone involved in the investigation for years to come. The abandoned veterinary clinic had been converted into what could only be described as a human experimentation facility. The main examination room contained multiple hospital beds equipped with restraints, IV equipment, and monitoring devices. Each bed had a television positioned directly above it, connected to VHS players loaded with the same children's educational programs that had been found playing in Dorothy Kellerman's house. But it was the room that Torres and Michelle had been using as an office that revealed the full horror of their operation. File cabinets contained detailed records on over 40 elderly victims, each file documenting months of systematic abuse, drug experimentation, and psychological torture. The files read like scientific research papers, complete with hypotheses, methodology, results, and conclusions. Harold Chen was found in one of the examination rooms, alive but in critical condition. He had been subjected to the same drug cocktail as Dorothy Kellerman, but in higher concentrations. The medical team that stabilized him for transport estimated that he would have died within hours if they hadn't found him when they did. Michelle Kellerman and Michael Torres were found in the facility's former operating room, and their condition when captured provided the most disturbing aspect of the entire case. Both were conscious and alert, showing no signs of the drugs they had been administering to their victims. Instead, they were calmly documenting their latest experiment on Harold Chen, taking notes and photographs as if his suffering was nothing more than data collection. When Torres was arrested, he was found carrying a notebook that contained what he called the final protocol, a detailed plan for establishing similar facilities in multiple states, each targeting elderly populations in rural areas where disappearances might not be noticed immediately. The plan included recruitment strategies for finding additional partners, methods for acquiring controlled substances, and techniques for disposing of victims whose experiments had been completed. Michelle Kellerman's arrest interview provided insights into the psychological pathology that had driven the entire operation. She showed no remorse for what she had done to her mother or any of the other victims, instead expressing frustration that the investigation had interrupted what she called important research. These people were going to die anyway, Michelle told Detective Russell during the interview. At least this way, their deaths served a purpose. We were learning things that could benefit society. When Russell asked about the psychological torture aspects, the repetitive children's programs, the furniture moving, the deliberate disorientation, Michelle's response was chillingly clinical. Psychological compliance is just as important as physical compliance, she explained without emotion. The audio-visual programming breaks down cognitive resistance and makes subjects more accepting of medical intervention. It's based on established psychological principles. Michael Torres, when interviewed separately, revealed the academic background that had informed their methodology. He had studied psychology and pharmacology at several universities, but had never completed a degree in either field. Instead, he had used his partial education to develop what he called applied gerontological research, using elderly subjects to test theories about pain tolerance, psychological manipulation, and pharmaceutical effects. The elderly population is ideal for this type of research, Torres told FBI agents with the same detached tone Michelle had used. They're isolated, often have existing medical conditions that mask experimental effects, and their families frequently expect cognitive decline, so unusual behavior goes unnoticed longer. The investigation eventually revealed that Michelle and Torres had been operating their network for over 3 years, with facilities in 4 states and a documented victim count that reached 47 elderly individuals. Of those, 31 had died from what had initially been classified as natural causes, while 16 had survived but with permanent neurological and psychological damage. Dorothy Kellerman, despite everything she had endured, proved to be one of the most resilient survivors. After weeks of treatment to clear the drugs from her system and therapy to address the psychological trauma, she was able to provide detailed testimony about her daughter's actions. Her hidden notes and her courage in documenting the abuse, even while being systematically poisoned, became crucial evidence in the prosecution. The trial of Michelle Kellerman and Michael Torres began 8 months later and lasted 6 weeks. The evidence presented included video recordings the defendants had made of their experiments, detailed documentation of their victims' suffering, and testimony from the survivors who were able to speak about their experiences. The most powerful testimony came from Harold Chen, who had recovered enough to describe the months of torture he had endured. "They treated me like I wasn't human," he told the court, "like I was just something they could use to test their theories. The worst part wasn't the drugs or the physical pain. It was realizing that they enjoyed watching me suffer." Jessica Hartman, the neighbor whose welfare check call had started the entire investigation, testified about the importance of community vigilance in protecting vulnerable populations. Her simple act of noticing that something was wrong with her elderly neighbor had ultimately saved lives and exposed a criminal network that might otherwise have continued operating indefinitely. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding both defendants guilty on all counts, including multiple charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, elder abuse, and conspiracy. Michelle Kellerman was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, while Michael Torres received the death penalty. But the most disturbing aspect of the case emerged during the penalty phase of the trial, when prosecutors revealed evidence that Michelle and Torres had been in contact with similar networks in other countries. Their operation appeared to be part of a larger, international network of individuals who shared techniques and research data about systematic elder abuse and human experimentation. Dorothy Kellerman attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row and looking directly at her daughter throughout the proceedings. When asked by reporters why she subjected herself to reliving the trauma, Dorothy's response was simple. People need to know what happened. Not just to me, but to all those other people who couldn't speak for themselves. The case led to significant changes in elder care oversight and welfare check protocols across multiple states. Jessica Hartman's original call became a training example for 911 dispatchers, emphasizing the importance of taking seriously any concerns about elderly residents, no matter how minor they might seem. Officer Marcus Thompson, whose thorough response to what seemed like a routine welfare check had uncovered the entire network, was promoted to detective and specialized in elder abuse cases. He often reflects on how easily the investigation could have gone differently if he had made different assumptions that night. "The thing that still haunts me," Thompson says, "is thinking about how many other Dorothy Kellermans might be out there right now, sitting in chairs, staring at televisions, waiting for someone to notice that something is wrong." Detective Amanda Russell led the task force that was formed to investigate similar networks across the country. The task force has since identified and shut down 3 additional operations that were using elderly victims for systematic abuse and experimentation. Dorothy Kellerman, now 83, lives in a secure assisted living facility where she feels safe for the first time in years. She has become an advocate for elderly rights and frequently speaks to law enforcement groups about recognizing signs of elder abuse. The facility where Michelle and Torres conducted their experiments has been demolished, but the site remains under federal investigation as authorities continue to search for additional victims who may have been buried on the property. In her final statement to the court, Michelle Kellerman showed no remorse and no acknowledgement of her crimes. Instead, she warned that shutting down her operation would not stop others like her from continuing the work she had started. "You can imprison me, but you can't imprison the knowledge," she told the judge. "There are others who understand the value of what we were doing. The research will continue." This statement led to an ongoing federal investigation into similar networks, and law enforcement agencies across the country now maintain specialized units focused on preventing and investigating systematic elder abuse operations. The case of Dorothy Kellerman stands as a testament to the importance of community vigilance and the courage of those who speak up when something seems wrong. It also serves as a chilling reminder that some of the most vulnerable members of society can become targets for predators who view their suffering as nothing more than an opportunity for experimentation and profit. The lights that blazed from every window of Dorothy's house on that March night in 2019 had illuminated something far darker than a simple medical emergency. They had revealed a network of systematic cruelty that had been operating in the shadows, protected by society's tendency to overlook and dismiss the concerns of elderly individuals. But those same lights had also led to justice for dozens of victims who might otherwise have died in anonymity, their suffering unknown, and their deaths unmourned. In the end, Dorothy Kellerman's courage in documenting her abuse, Jessica Hartman's decision to make a welfare check call, and Officer Thompson's thorough investigation had combined to expose a horror that was far worse than any routine graveyard shift patrol could have anticipated. Officer Nicole Patterson had been working the graveyard shift for the Riverside Police Department for 6 years, and she thought she had seen every type of repeat caller situation the city could produce. Frequent domestic disturbance addresses, mental health crisis locations, and the usual problem properties that required regular police attention. All routine situations that patrol officers learned to handle with a combination of professionalism and patience. But on the night of September 3, 2020, at exactly 1:23 a.m., Officer Patterson would receive a call that would begin one of the most complex investigations in the department's history. Officer Patterson was conducting her regular patrol of the Desert View area when dispatch radioed her to respond to 2847 Desert View Road for a burglary in progress. The caller, identified as Kyle Morrison, age 73, had reported hearing intruders in his house and was requesting immediate police response. Patterson had been patrolling this area for 3 years and was familiar with most of the residents, including Morrison, whom she had encountered during previous welfare checks and community policing initiatives. Morrison was known as a quiet, elderly man who lived alone in a well-maintained ranch home and rarely called for police assistance. As Patterson pulled up to Morrison's address, she immediately began her standard response protocol for burglary calls. The house appeared secure from the outside, with no visible signs of forced entry or disturbance. Morrison's 2018 Toyota Camry was parked in the driveway, and there were no other vehicles present that might belong to potential intruders. Officer Patterson approached the front door and knocked, identifying herself as police. Morrison answered quickly, appearing exactly as his voice had suggested over the phone. Elderly, frightened, and genuinely convinced that someone had been in his house. "Thank God you're here, officer," Morrison said, clutching a baseball bat he had apparently armed himself with. "I heard them moving around downstairs for at least 20 minutes. Glass breaking, footsteps in the kitchen, someone opening and closing cabinets." Patterson followed her standard procedure for burglary calls, conducting a thorough search of Morrison's house with Morrison accompanying her. The home was neat, well-maintained, and showed no signs of forced entry or disturbance. All windows were intact and locked from the inside. Both doors showed no evidence of tampering, and most importantly, there was no indication that anyone other than Morrison had been in the house. "Mr. Morrison, I've checked everything thoroughly, and there's no sign that anyone has been inside your home," Officer Patterson explained professionally. "All your doors and windows are secure, and I haven't found any evidence of an intruder. Is it possible you might have heard sounds from outside, or perhaps from your television or radio?" Morrison seemed genuinely confused by Patterson's assessment. "But I know what I heard, officer. Someone was definitely in my kitchen. I could hear them going through my cabinets and moving things around." Patterson spent additional time checking areas Morrison was particularly concerned about, including the basement and attic spaces, but found no evidence that anyone had been present. She documented the call thoroughly, noting Morrison's genuine belief that he had heard intruders despite the complete absence of supporting evidence. After ensuring Morrison felt secure and advising him about home security measures, Patterson cleared the call and returned to patrol. She made a note in her report that Morrison might benefit from a welfare check follow-up, as elderly residents living alone sometimes experienced confusion about sounds they heard, particularly at night. 3 days later, during another graveyard shift patrol, Officer Patterson received another dispatch to 2847 Desert View Road. This time, Morrison reported that the intruders had returned and that he could hear multiple people in his living room. Patterson responded immediately, recognizing the address and Morrison's voice when dispatch played back portions of his call. When she arrived at Morrison's house, she found the same scenario as before. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of intruders, and Morrison convinced that people had been inside his home. This time, however, Patterson noticed something during her search that she had missed during the first call. Morrison's television was on in the living room, tuned to a late-night program with the volume turned down low. When Patterson asked about it, Morrison seemed surprised. "I didn't turn that on, officer. I was upstairs in my bedroom when I heard them come in. The television was definitely off when I went to bed." Patterson checked the TV's timer settings and found that it could have been programmed to turn on automatically, though Morrison claimed he had never used such features. While this could explain some of the sounds Morrison had reported hearing, it didn't account for his detailed descriptions of multiple people moving through his house. Patterson again conducted a complete search of the property and found nothing suspicious. She spent considerable time talking with Morrison about home security and suggested that he might want to consult with his physician about possible hearing changes that could cause sounds to seem more significant than they actually were. Over the following 2 weeks, Officer Patterson responded to 6 more calls from Kyle Morrison, all following the same pattern. Each call came in during the early morning hours, typically between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. Each time, Morrison reported hearing intruders in his house. Sometimes one person, sometimes multiple people. He described hearing conversations, furniture being moved, appliances being used, and in one case, what sounded like a party with music and laughter. Each time, Patterson responded professionally and found no evidence of anyone having been inside Morrison's house. She began to notice patterns in Morrison's calls that suggested he might be experiencing some form of age-related hearing changes, or possibly early-stage dementia. The intruders, he reported, always seemed to leave just before police arrived, never left any physical evidence, and never actually confronted Morrison directly. By the 8th call, Patterson had developed a routine for Morrison's reports. She would respond, conduct a thorough search, and spend time talking with Morrison to help him feel secure. Patterson began to view these calls as informal, welfare checks rather than actual emergencies, though she continued to respond with the same professionalism and thoroughness she brought to every call. However, on September 24th, Patterson received a call from Morrison that was markedly different from all the previous reports. Instead of describing active intruders, Morrison's voice carried a different kind of concern. "Officer Patterson, something's wrong with my house," Morrison said when she answered his call. "I think someone has been coming in when I'm not home. Things are different. Food is missing from my refrigerator, and I found clothes in my closet that aren't mine." Patterson immediately dispatched herself to Morrison's address for what had become a familiar visit. When she arrived, Morrison led her through the house, pointing out changes he claimed to have discovered since their last interaction. "This jacket in my closet, I've never seen it before," Morrison said, showing Patterson a blue windbreaker hanging among his clothes. "And look, in my refrigerator. I had a full carton of milk yesterday and now it's half empty. Someone has been eating my food and using my things." Patterson examined the jacket and found that it was Morrison's size and appeared to have been worn recently. The refrigerator did show signs of food having been consumed, but based on her previous interactions with Morrison, Patterson knew that his memory of his own activities wasn't always reliable. "Mr. Morrison, is it possible you forgot that you purchased this jacket? Or that you've been consuming more food than you remember?" Patterson asked gently, following standard protocol for dealing with elderly residents who might be experiencing memory issues. Morrison became more agitated than Patterson had seen him during previous calls. "Officer, I know my own belongings. I know what I buy and what I eat. Someone has been living in my house when I'm away, and they've been careful to make it look like I'm imagining things." This time, however, Patterson noticed something during her examination that made her reconsider Morrison's claims. Morrison's house, which had always been meticulously clean and organized during her previous visits, showed subtle signs of disarray. Magazines were stacked differently than before. Furniture was positioned slightly off from where she remembered it being, and there were coffee rings on tables where Morrison had previously told her he never drank coffee. More significantly, Patterson found something in Morrison's trash that hadn't been there during previous visits: empty containers from meals that Morrison claimed he hadn't eaten, including Chinese takeout containers from a restaurant Morrison insisted he had never ordered from. "Mr. Morrison, do you remember ordering Chinese food recently?" Patterson asked, following proper investigative procedure. "I hate Chinese food, officer. I haven't eaten it in 20 years. But I found those containers in my kitchen this morning, along with chopsticks and fortune cookies. Someone is definitely coming into my house." For the first time since Morrison's calls had started, Officer Patterson began to consider that Morrison might be telling the truth. The evidence was subtle but consistent. Someone could potentially be entering Morrison's house when he wasn't home, using his utilities, consuming his food, and leaving just enough evidence to make Morrison question his own memory and perception. Patterson decided to take a more investigative approach to Morrison's situation. "Sir, what is your daily routine? What time do you usually leave the house and where do you go?" Morrison explained that he left every Tuesday and Thursday morning at 9 a.m. for physical therapy appointments at a clinic about 30 minutes away. The appointments lasted 2 hours, plus travel time, meaning he was away from home for approximately 4 hours twice a week. "And do you go anywhere else regularly?" Patterson asked, following standard questioning procedures for potential break-in cases. "I go grocery shopping every Saturday morning, and I have lunch with my daughter every other Sunday. But other than that, I'm home most of the time." Patterson realized that someone could potentially be monitoring Morrison's routine and entering his house during the predictable times when he was away. The pattern of Morrison's nighttime calls had always occurred on Tuesday nights or Thursday nights, the nights after his physical therapy appointments. "Mr. Morrison, I want to try something different this week," Patterson said, shifting from routine response to active investigation. "Instead of just responding to your calls, I'm going to coordinate with other officers to do some surveillance of your house, particularly on the days when you have appointments. If someone is entering your home during those times, we might be able to catch them in the act." Patterson radioed her supervisor, Sergeant Marcus Williams, to report her change in assessment of Morrison's situation. For the first time since the calls had started, she was treating Morrison's reports as potentially legitimate criminal activity, rather than the confused fears of an elderly man experiencing age-related issues. The next Tuesday, September 29th, Officer Patterson arranged for Detective Brandon Cruz, who specialized in burglary and residential break-in cases, to conduct surveillance of Morrison's house while he was at his physical therapy appointment. Detective Cruz positioned himself where he could observe the house without being detected by anyone who might be watching the property. At 10:30 a.m., while Morrison was at his appointment, Detective Cruz observed a white van pull into Morrison's driveway. A man in his 30s got out of the van, walked to Morrison's front door, and let himself into the house using what appeared to be a key. Cruz immediately radioed for backup and continued to observe the house. The man remained inside for approximately 2 hours, leaving at 12:45 p.m., just 15 minutes before Morrison typically returned from his appointments. Instead of approaching the suspect immediately, Cruz decided to follow the van to determine where it went and gather more intelligence about the suspect's activities. The van led him to a storage facility on the outskirts of town, where the suspect unloaded several items into a rented storage unit before driving to what appeared to be his permanent residence. Cruz coordinated with Officer Patterson and other units to maintain surveillance on both the suspect's home and Morrison's house. The investigation had shifted from responding to Morrison's calls to actively investigating what appeared to be a sophisticated break-in operation. The surveillance operation revealed a pattern that was far more disturbing than a simple burglary case. The suspect, later identified as 34-year-old Derek Mitchell, was not stealing items from Morrison's house in any conventional sense. Instead, Mitchell was using Morrison's home as a secondary residence, consuming his food, using his utilities, and treating the house as if it were his own part-time living space. Detective Cruz's investigation revealed that Mitchell's activities were far more sophisticated and psychologically manipulative than typical break-in cases. Mitchell was deliberately leaving evidence of his presence in ways designed to make Morrison question his own memory and sanity, while simultaneously using Morrison's house for his own purposes. Mitchell would move items slightly, consume food but not empty containers completely, wear Morrison's clothes and then return them to slightly different positions, and use appliances that Morrison rarely used. Most disturbing was Cruz's discovery that Mitchell had been gradually introducing items into Morrison's house that didn't belong to Morrison. The jacket Morrison had found, food preferences Morrison didn't share, and personal items that would make Morrison doubt his own possessions. Detective Cruz realized they were dealing with a sophisticated form of psychological harassment known as gaslighting, where the perpetrator manipulates a victim's environment to make them question their own perceptions and memory. Mitchell had been systematically undermining Morrison's confidence in his own mental faculties while using his house as a free place to stay. The investigation took an even more disturbing turn when Cruz discovered that Mitchell had installed small surveillance cameras in Morrison's house, allowing him to monitor Morrison's routine and ensure that he only entered the house when Morrison was away. Mitchell had been watching Morrison's daily activities, learning his schedule, and timing his intrusions to avoid detection. But Mitchell had made one crucial miscalculation in his operation. He hadn't anticipated that Morrison would start hearing him during his nighttime visits, leading to the series of calls that had ultimately brought police attention to his activities. Detective Cruz's expanded surveillance of Mitchell revealed that his activities at Morrison's house extended far beyond a simple unauthorized entry. On October 1st, Cruz observed Mitchell entering Morrison's house at 11:30 p.m., while Morrison was asleep upstairs. Instead of leaving before Morrison woke up, Mitchell spent the entire night in the house, moving through the downstairs rooms and conducting what appeared to be deliberate activities designed to create noise. Cruz positioned additional surveillance equipment near Morrison's house and was able to record the sounds that Morrison had been reporting to Officer Patterson: footsteps, furniture being moved, cabinet doors opening and closing, and even what sounded like multiple people talking. All of these sounds were being created by Mitchell alone, who was systematically going through Morrison's house and creating a deliberate audio environment designed to frighten and confuse the elderly man. More disturbing was Cruz's realization that Mitchell was timing his nighttime activities to coincide with periods when Morrison would be most vulnerable to psychological manipulation. Mitchell would create sounds for several hours, then leave just before Morrison would likely call police. By the time officers like Patterson arrived, Mitchell would be gone, leaving Morrison to appear confused and possibly mentally unstable to the responding officers. Detective Cruz's investigation revealed that Mitchell had been studying Morrison's behavior patterns for months before beginning his psychological campaign. Mitchell had access to Morrison's medical records through his employment at a medical billing company, and had specifically chosen Morrison as a target because his age and living situation made him an ideal victim for long-term manipulation and exploitation. The surveillance also revealed that Mitchell was not working alone in his operation against Morrison. On the night of October 2nd, Cruz observed a second person accompanying Mitchell into Morrison's house. The accomplice, later identified as 29-year-old Jessica Palmer, appeared to be helping Mitchell with a more elaborate operation than simple residential exploitation. Palmer carried what appeared to be recording equipment into Morrison's house, and the two spent several hours setting up what Cruz later realized was a sophisticated audio system designed to create the illusion of multiple people being present in the house. They were literally staging fake break-in scenarios while Morrison was upstairs, creating realistic sound effects that would convince anyone listening that multiple intruders were present. Detective Cruz coordinated with Officer Patterson to set up a trap for Mitchell and Palmer. Instead of approaching them immediately, they decided to wait until Mitchell and Palmer were in the middle of one of their staged scenarios, then surround the house and document their activities in progress. The opportunity came on October 5th, when Cruz observed Mitchell and Palmer entering Morrison's house at 1:15 a.m. This time, however, Cruz had arranged for Morrison to be staying overnight at his daughter's house, allowing police to observe Mitchell and Palmer's activities without putting Morrison at risk. What Cruz witnessed through thermal imaging equipment was a carefully orchestrated psychological manipulation session. Mitchell and Palmer moved through Morrison's house creating deliberate noise, recording their activities, and setting up equipment that would allow them to replay the sounds later. They were not only tormenting Morrison in real time, but creating audio recordings that they could use to continue the harassment even when they weren't physically present. Most disturbing was Cruz's discovery that Mitchell and Palmer had installed speakers throughout Morrison's house, hidden in places where they wouldn't be easily detected. These speakers were connected to timers and remote controls that allowed Mitchell to play back recorded sounds at predetermined times, creating the illusion of intruders even when Mitchell and Palmer were nowhere near the property. Detective Cruz realized that some of Morrison's calls to Officer Patterson had been triggered not by Mitchell and Palmer being physically present in the house, but by remotely activated audio systems that Mitchell had installed during his daytime entries. Morrison had been hearing real sounds of people in his house, but the sounds were recordings played through hidden speakers rather than live intruders. At 2:30 a.m. on October 5th, Cruz gave the signal for patrol units to surround Morrison's house. When officers entered the property, they found Mitchell and Palmer in Morrison's living room with sophisticated audio recording and playback equipment, along with detailed notes about Morrison's daily routine, sleep patterns, and psychological responses to their harassment campaign. Mitchell and Palmer were arrested without incident, but their responses during police questioning revealed the full extent of their psychological manipulation operation. Mitchell showed no remorse for his actions, instead expressing frustration that his research project had been interrupted by law enforcement intervention. "We were studying the effects of prolonged psychological stress on elderly individuals living alone," Mitchell told Detective Cruz during his interrogation. Kyle Morrison was an ideal test subject because of his isolation and predictable routine. We were documenting how long it would take to completely undermine his confidence in his own perceptions. Palmer, when questioned separately by Officer Patterson, revealed that their activities with Morrison were part of a larger scheme, targeting multiple elderly individuals across Riverside County. They had identified at least 12 other potential victims using medical records and public information about elderly residents who lived alone. "Derek had a whole system worked out," Palmer told Patterson during her interview. "We would study potential targets for months, learning their routines and vulnerabilities, then begin psychological manipulation campaigns designed to make them doubt their own sanity. The goal was to eventually gain enough psychological control over them to access their financial accounts and personal assets." Detective Cruz realized they were dealing with a sophisticated elder exploitation scheme that used psychological torture as a precursor to financial fraud. Mitchell and Palmer hadn't been content with simple burglary or theft. They had been systematically breaking down elderly victims' mental defenses to make them easier targets for long-term financial manipulation. The police investigation revealed that Mitchell and Palmer had already successfully completed their psychological manipulation process with two other elderly victims in the county. Both victims had eventually become so convinced that they were losing their mental faculties that they had voluntarily signed over financial power of attorney to individuals recommended by Mitchell and Palmer. Those individuals who presented themselves as elder care specialists were actually part of Mitchell's criminal network. Once they gained financial control over the victims, they systematically drained bank accounts, sold property, and liquidated assets, while the victims remained convinced that their own memory problems were preventing them from managing their affairs properly. Kyle Morrison had been targeted as Mitchell and Palmer's third victim, but his decision to consistently call police rather than simply accepting that he was hearing things had disrupted their timeline and ultimately led to their capture. When Morrison was informed about Mitchell and Palmer's arrest and the true nature of what he had been experiencing, his reaction was a mixture of relief and anger toward the criminals who had targeted him. "I knew I wasn't losing my mind," Morrison told Detective Cruz and Officer Patterson during his debriefing. "I knew what I was hearing was real. But when the police kept finding nothing, I started to doubt myself. That's exactly what they wanted to accomplish." Morrison's house was thoroughly searched by police forensic specialists, who found over 30 hidden speakers, 12 surveillance cameras, and enough recording equipment to stage elaborate fake scenarios. Mitchell had essentially turned Morrison's home into a sophisticated psychological torture chamber, with the ability to create any audio environment he desired at the touch of a button. The discovery of Morrison's case led to a broader police investigation that eventually identified Mitchell and Palmer's network of accomplices and victims. In total, 7 elderly individuals had been targeted for psychological manipulation, with 3 having already been financially exploited before Mitchell and Palmer's arrest. The other victims, when contacted by police, initially had difficulty believing that their experiences had been artificially created. Like Morrison, they had been systematically convinced that they were experiencing age-related mental decline, and some had already made arrangements for assisted living, or had signed over financial responsibilities to third parties. Dr. Amanda Harris, a geriatric psychiatrist who was consulted during the police investigation, explained the psychological impact of Mitchell and Palmer's tactics to the investigating officers. "What they were doing represents one of the most sophisticated forms of elder abuse I've ever encountered in my consulting work with law enforcement. They were using advanced psychological manipulation techniques to convince their victims that they were losing their mental faculties, then exploiting that manufactured vulnerability for financial gain." Dr. Harris noted that the victims' consistent reports of hearing intruders, combined with the complete lack of physical evidence found by responding officers, had initially led both medical professionals and law enforcement to assume they were experiencing dementia-related hallucinations. The perpetrators understood that elderly individuals reporting strange sounds or events would likely be dismissed as confused or mentally declining, which provided perfect cover for their activities. The criminal case against Mitchell and Palmer was strengthened by the detailed documentation they had kept of their psychological manipulation campaigns. Mitchell's notebooks contained clinical observations about each victim's responses to different types of harassment, along with timelines for escalating the psychological pressure until the victims would accept outside help managing their affairs. Officer Patterson, who had taken all of Morrison's calls and eventually shifted from viewing them as welfare checks to treating them as legitimate criminal reports, testified about the pattern she had observed in Morrison's reports during the investigation phase. "Looking back, I can see that Mr. Morrison was incredibly consistent in his descriptions of what he was hearing. The details never changed, and his level of fear was always genuine. I wish I had recognized sooner that someone might actually be deliberately creating those sounds." The trial of Derek Mitchell and Jessica Palmer revealed the full scope of their criminal enterprise and its impact on the elderly victims they had targeted. Mitchell was found guilty of elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, burglary, and psychological torture. Palmer was convicted on similar charges, along with conspiracy to commit financial fraud. During the sentencing phase, several victims testified about the long-term psychological impact of Mitchell and Palmer's manipulation campaign. One victim, 78-year-old Margaret Santos, described how the psychological harassment had destroyed her confidence in her own mental abilities. "They didn't just steal from me," Santos told the court during her victim impact statement. "They stole my faith in my own mind. Even now, knowing that what I experienced wasn't real, I still doubt myself when I hear unexpected sounds in my house." Kyle Morrison's victim impact statement focused on the broader implications of Mitchell and Palmer's crimes for elderly residents and the law enforcement officers who served them. "These people didn't just target my property or my money. They targeted my sanity, my independence, and my dignity. They wanted to convince me that I was losing my mind so they could control every aspect of my life." Mitchell showed no remorse during the trial, instead maintaining that his activities had been research designed to better understand the psychological vulnerabilities of elderly individuals. His complete lack of empathy for his victims and his clinical approach to their suffering disturbed everyone involved in the prosecution. Palmer, in contrast, eventually expressed remorse for her actions and cooperated with prosecutors to identify other potential victims and accomplices in the network. Her cooperation led to the recovery of over $300,000 in assets that had been stolen from elderly victims through the psychological manipulation scheme. But it was Palmer's cooperation that revealed the true scope of what the police investigation had uncovered. During her plea negotiations, Palmer provided information about additional participants in Mitchell's network that extended far beyond Riverside County. What had initially appeared to be a local elder abuse scheme was actually part of a coordinated operation spanning multiple states. Derek was in regular contact with people doing similar operations in Arizona, Nevada, and Colorado, Palmer told prosecutors during her debriefing. They shared information about techniques that worked, ways to avoid detection by law enforcement, and methods for identifying ideal targets. There was an entire online community of people doing this. Detective Cruz's investigation expanded as Palmer provided details about the network's communication methods and organizational structure. Mitchell had been part of what essentially amounted to a criminal franchise system, where experienced operators like himself would train newcomers in psychological manipulation techniques and help them establish their own elder abuse operations in different geographic areas. The FBI's Crimes Against Seniors Unit took over portions of the investigation when the multi-state nature of the network became apparent. Special Agent Rachel Thompson, who specialized in organized elder fraud schemes, coordinated with law enforcement agencies in 6 states to simultaneously investigate Mitchell's associates and their victims. What Agent Thompson's investigation revealed was more disturbing than the local police had initially anticipated. Mitchell's network had developed what they called standardized protocols for psychological manipulation of elderly victims. These protocols had been refined over several years and were being distributed through encrypted online forums where participants shared their experiences and improved their techniques. The protocols discovered by federal investigators were disturbingly comprehensive, covering every aspect of victim selection, surveillance, psychological profiling, and manipulation. Mitchell had essentially created an instruction manual for systematic elder abuse that could be replicated by anyone with basic technical skills and access to elderly targets. Agent Thompson's team discovered that the network maintained detailed databases of elderly individuals across multiple states, complete with information about their living situations, medical conditions, financial status, and family relationships. This information was being gathered from multiple sources, including medical billing records, public records, and social media surveillance. Most chilling was the discovery that the network had been conducting what they called test operations in rural communities where law enforcement resources were limited, and elderly residents were more isolated. These test operations allowed new participants to practice their psychological manipulation techniques on victims who were less likely to report suspicious activities to police or be believed if they did report them. The investigation identified at least 47 elderly victims across 6 states who had been targeted by Mitchell's network over a 3-year period. Of these, 23 had died during or shortly after the psychological manipulation campaigns, though investigators were unable to determine how many of these deaths were directly caused by the stress and trauma of the abuse versus natural causes. What made the investigation particularly disturbing was the clinical nature of the network's documentation. Participants kept detailed records of their victims' psychological responses to different types of harassment, creating what amounted to research data on the most effective methods for breaking down elderly individuals' mental defenses. Dr. James Patterson, a forensic psychologist who was consulted during the federal investigation, described the network's methods as representing one of the most sophisticated applications of psychological torture techniques he had encountered outside of military or intelligence contexts. What these individuals developed was essentially a systematic approach to psychological warfare against vulnerable elderly populations, Dr. Patterson explained in his report to federal investigators. The techniques they used were designed to create maximum psychological distress while leaving minimal physical evidence, making detection by law enforcement extremely difficult. The investigation also revealed that Mitchell's network had been evolving their techniques based on law enforcement responses to their activities. When psychological manipulation alone wasn't sufficient to gain control over victims, they had begun incorporating physical surveillance, medical fraud, and, in some cases, direct threats against family members. Agent Thompson's team discovered evidence that the network had been infiltrating assisted living facilities, nursing homes, and home health care services to gain direct access to potential victims. Several participants in the network had obtained employment or volunteer positions that gave them legitimate reasons to be in contact with elderly individuals, allowing them to conduct initial assessments and surveillance without arousing suspicion from family members or caregivers. The case took an even more disturbing turn when investigators discovered that Mitchell's network had been documenting their activities not just for operational purposes, but for entertainment. Encrypted video files recovered from Mitchell's computer showed surveillance footage of elderly victims during psychological manipulation sessions, along with audio recordings of distressed phone calls to police dispatchers like Officer Patterson. These recordings had been shared among network participants as examples of successful operations, and were being used to train new participants in effective manipulation techniques. The realization that elderly victims' terror and confusion had been treated as entertainment by the network participants added another layer of horror to an already disturbing case. Officer Patterson, whose pattern recognition and eventual shift to treating Morrison's calls as legitimate, had initiated the investigation that exposed Mitchell's network, found herself at the center of what had become the largest organized elder abuse investigation in California history. Her decision to take Morrison's complaints seriously had ultimately exposed a criminal network that law enforcement agencies had been unaware even existed. "The thing that still haunts me about this case," Patterson reflected during a later interview with law enforcement media, "is how easily it could have continued indefinitely. If Kyle Morrison hadn't been persistent in calling police, if I hadn't eventually recognized the pattern in his reports, if Detective Cruz hadn't decided to take surveillance seriously, this network could still be operating today. The FBI's investigation eventually led to arrests in 6 states and the identification of over 100 elderly victims who had been targeted by Mitchell's network or similar operations. Many of these victims had died before the network was exposed, taking with them the full extent of the psychological torture they had endured. The trial phase of the Mitchell Network case began 18 months after Morrison's first call to Officer Patterson, and lasted for over a year as prosecutors worked to present evidence against 14 defendants across multiple jurisdictions. The complexity of the case required coordination between federal and state prosecutors, and the testimony of dozens of elderly victims who had survived the psychological manipulation campaigns. Mitchell himself was found guilty on 47 counts of elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and what prosecutors termed systematic psychological torture. The judge, in imposing Mitchell's sentence, noted that the case represented a new category of criminal behavior that existing laws were barely adequate to address. Mr. Mitchell, you have systematically weaponized the trust and vulnerability of elderly citizens against them, Judge Patricia Williams stated during sentencing. You have created an industry of psychological torture that has caused immeasurable suffering to some of our society's most vulnerable members. Mitchell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, becoming one of the first individuals in California history to receive a life sentence for elder abuse crimes that did not involve physical violence or murder. The precedent set by his sentencing would later influence how similar cases were prosecuted in other jurisdictions. Palmer received a sentence of 25 years with the possibility of parole after 15 years, a reduction from the life sentence she might have faced due to her cooperation with investigators. Her testimony had been crucial in exposing the full extent of the network and identifying victims who might otherwise never have been discovered. The psychological impact on the victims who survived Mitchell's network was severe and lasting. Follow-up studies conducted by Dr. Patterson found that many victims continued to experience symptoms consistent with complex post-traumatic stress disorder years after their abuse had ended. Kyle Morrison, despite being one of the victims who had suffered the least extensive abuse due to the early intervention by law enforcement, continued to struggle with the psychological effects of his experience. He installed extensive security systems in his home, moved his bedroom to the ground floor to avoid being isolated upstairs, and required ongoing therapy to address persistent anxiety and hypervigilance. The worst part isn't even what they did to me, Morrison told Dr. Patterson during a follow-up interview 2 years after Mitchell's arrest. It's knowing that they're still out there. Maybe not Derek Mitchell specifically, but others like him. People who see elderly individuals as nothing more than test subjects for their sick experiments. Morrison's concern proved to be well-founded. Despite the success in dismantling Mitchell's specific network, Agent Thompson's investigation revealed that similar operations were continuing to emerge in other parts of the country. The techniques and protocols that Mitchell had developed were still circulating in online communities, and new operators were adapting them for use in different regions. The FBI established a specialized task force focused on organized elder abuse schemes, with Agent Thompson serving as its director. The task force worked to identify and shut down operations similar to Mitchell's network. But the distributed nature of the criminal activity and the vulnerability of the target population made complete prevention extremely difficult. Officer Patterson, whose pattern recognition had been crucial in exposing Mitchell's network, found herself dealing with long-term effects as well. She had developed what her department psychologist described as hypervigilance toward elderly callers, becoming intensely focused on identifying potential patterns of abuse in routine police calls. Every time an elderly person calls for police assistance now, I find myself analyzing their voice for signs of long-term psychological manipulation. Patterson explained during a law enforcement conference on elder abuse recognition. I know that sounds like it might be excessive, but Kyle Morrison taught me that sometimes the most persistent callers are the ones who most need our help. Patterson became an advocate for improved training for police officers in recognizing signs of systematic elder abuse, and her protocols for pattern recognition in emergency calls were adopted by police departments across the country. Her experience with the Morrison case had demonstrated that patrol officers were often the first line of defense for elderly victims of psychological manipulation. Detective Brandon Cruz, who had conducted the crucial surveillance that led to Mitchell and Palmer's arrest, became an instructor in recognizing signs of psychological manipulation and elder abuse, emphasizing to other officers the importance of taking elderly residents' reports seriously, even when they initially appeared implausible or inconsistent with physical evidence. I was trained to look for physical evidence of crimes, Cruz reflected during a training session for other detectives. No one taught me to recognize that the absence of physical evidence might itself be evidence of a sophisticated crime designed to leave no physical traces. The Morrison case led to significant changes in how law enforcement agencies across the country approach reports of suspicious activity from elderly residents. Training programs now emphasize the importance of pattern recognition and the potential for sophisticated criminals to exploit elderly individuals' vulnerability in ways that leave minimal physical evidence. Perhaps most significantly, the case led to the establishment of specialized elder abuse investigation units in police departments nationwide. These units, staffed by officers trained specifically in the psychology of elder abuse and the techniques used by perpetrators, have been successful in identifying and stopping similar operations before they can cause extensive harm. The legislation that emerged from the Mitchell case, known as the Kyle Morrison Elder Protection Act, established federal penalties specifically for psychological manipulation of elderly individuals and provided funding for specialized investigation units and victim support services. The act recognized psychological torture as a distinct category of elder abuse and provided law enforcement agencies with tools specifically designed to investigate and prosecute such crimes. Kyle Morrison, now 75, continues to live independently in his home on Desert View Road, though he has installed a comprehensive security system and maintains regular contact with local law enforcement and participates in community education programs about elder abuse recognition. He has become a powerful advocate for elderly residents who report suspicious activities, emphasizing the importance of persistence even when initial reports are dismissed. I was lucky that I kept calling police even when it seemed like they thought I was imagining things, Morrison tells audiences at community education sessions. But luck shouldn't be what determines whether elderly people get help when they're being targeted by criminals. We need systems in place to recognize and respond to these kinds of sophisticated abuse schemes. Derek Mitchell remains incarcerated in a federal maximum security facility, where he is serving his life sentence. Prison officials report that he continues to maintain detailed journals and correspondence with other inmates, apparently still studying psychological manipulation techniques even while imprisoned. His continued interest in the subject has led to his placement in protective custody and restrictions on his communications with the outside world. Jessica Palmer was released on parole after serving 12 years of her sentence. She now works with victim advocacy organizations and law enforcement agencies, providing training on recognizing and investigating psychological manipulation schemes. Her cooperation with investigators and ongoing efforts to help other victims have been credited with preventing similar operations from developing in several states. Officer Nicole Patterson continues to serve with the Riverside Police Department and has been promoted to sergeant. specializing in crimes against vulnerable populations. She often reflects on how Morrison's persistent calls led to the exposure of a criminal network that most police officers never imagined could exist. The Mitchell case taught us that elder abuse has evolved far beyond the simple financial exploitation or physical neglect that we used to focus on. Patterson explains to audiences of investigators and prosecutors. We're now dealing with criminals who understand psychology, technology, and law enforcement procedures well enough to create abuse schemes that are nearly invisible to traditional investigation methods. The online communities where Mitchell's network had shared techniques and coordinated activities remain a focus of ongoing FBI investigation. While the specific forums used by Mitchell's network have been shut down, new communities continue to emerge, requiring constant vigilance from law enforcement agencies specializing in digital crimes. Agent Thompson's task force has identified and disrupted 12 additional elder abuse networks since the Mitchell case, preventing an estimated $2.3 million in financial fraud and protecting over 200 elderly individuals from psychological manipulation campaigns. However, Thompson acknowledges that the distributed nature of these criminal operations makes complete prevention extremely challenging. For every network we identify and shut down, we have to assume there are others operating that we haven't discovered yet, Thompson explains to law enforcement conferences. The techniques are out there, the vulnerable population continues to grow, and the financial incentives for criminals remain strong. This is going to be an ongoing battle for law enforcement. The case of Kyle Morrison and the night shift serial caller has fundamentally changed how law enforcement agencies approach reports of suspicious activity from elderly residents. What began as a routine response to repeated calls has become a landmark case in the recognition and investigation of sophisticated elder abuse schemes. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Morrison case is the recognition that elderly individuals reporting seemingly implausible events may be victims of crimes specifically designed to make their reports seem implausible to law enforcement. The systematic psychological manipulation that Kyle Morrison endured was intended to make him appear confused or mentally unstable to the very police officers he was calling for help. In the end, Morrison's persistence in calling police, Officer Patterson's eventual recognition of patterns in those calls, and Detective Cruz's decision to take those patterns seriously combined to expose a criminal network that might otherwise have continued operating indefinitely. Their experience serves as a reminder that sometimes the most important thing law enforcement can do is simply listen carefully to the people who need help the most, even when their stories initially seem impossible to believe. The case has also highlighted the importance of community policing and building relationships with vulnerable populations. Officer Patterson's familiarity with Morrison and her willingness to spend time on what initially appeared to be routine welfare checks ultimately led to the exposure of a sophisticated criminal network. Detective Cruz's surveillance work demonstrated the value of taking a proactive investigative approach to cases that might initially appear to be minor or routine. His decision to treat Morrison's situation as a potential crime rather than simply a welfare issue, was crucial to breaking the case. The Morrison case continues to be studied at police academies and law enforcement training centers across the country as an example of how routine police work can uncover sophisticated criminal operations. It serves as a reminder that the most important cases often begin with the most mundane calls. For the Riverside Police Department, the case led to fundamental changes in how officers approach elderly residents and reports of suspicious activity. The department now has specialized protocols for handling reports from elderly residents, emphasizing the importance of pattern recognition and thorough documentation. The case also demonstrated the value of interdisciplinary cooperation in law enforcement. The collaboration between patrol officers like Patterson, detectives like Cruz, federal agents like Thompson, and mental health professionals like Dr. Harris was essential to understanding and prosecuting the full scope of Mitchell's network. Today, when police officers across the country receive calls from elderly residents reporting suspicious activities, they are trained to listen not just for immediate threats, but for patterns that might indicate long-term psychological manipulation. Kyle Morrison's voice, frightened and confused during those September nights in 2020, has become a training example for thousands of law enforcement officers who now understand that sometimes the most persistent callers are the ones who most desperately need someone to believe them. The legacy of the Morrison case extends beyond law enforcement training to broader community awareness about elder abuse and the importance of taking elderly residents' concerns seriously. Community organizations, healthcare providers, and social services now work more closely with police departments to identify and prevent sophisticated elder abuse schemes. The case has also influenced legislation at both state and federal levels, leading to increased funding for elder abuse investigation and prevention programs, stronger penalties for psychological manipulation of elderly individuals, and better training for law enforcement officers in recognizing sophisticated abuse schemes. Perhaps most importantly, the Morrison case has demonstrated that elderly individuals who report seemingly unusual or implausible events should be taken seriously, and their reports thoroughly investigated. The case serves as a powerful reminder that criminals often specifically target vulnerable populations, precisely because they know their victims are less likely to be believed by authorities. Kyle Morrison's courage in continuing to call police, even when he began to doubt his own perceptions. Officer Patterson's professionalism in treating each call seriously, and Detective Cruz's investigative skills in recognizing the true nature of the situation combined to expose a criminal network that was causing immeasurable harm to vulnerable elderly individuals. The Mitchell case stands as one of the most important elder abuse investigations in modern law enforcement history, not just because of the number of victims involved or the sophistication of the criminal network, but because it fundamentally changed how law enforcement agencies think about protecting vulnerable populations from sophisticated predators. The case continues to influence law enforcement training, community policing practices, and elder abuse prevention efforts across the country. It serves as a permanent reminder that the most vulnerable members of our communities deserve the same level of professional investigation and protection as any other crime victims, and that sometimes the most important thing law enforcement can do is simply listen and believe. Officer Brandon Coleman had been working the graveyard shift for the Riverside Police Department for 8 years, and he thought he had seen every type of abandoned vehicle situation the city could produce. Cars left by drunk drivers who had walked home, vehicles abandoned after minor accidents, or simply broken-down cars whose owners planned to retrieve them in the morning. All routine situations that required standard documentation and towing procedures. But on the night of November 18, 2021, at 2:17 a.m., Coleman would discover a 2019 black Chevrolet Impala in the parking lot of an abandoned shopping center that would launch an investigation into one of the most disturbing cases in the department's history. The Impala was parked in the far corner of the lot behind what used to be Morrison's department store, a massive retail space that had been empty for 3 years. Coleman had been patrolling this area regularly as part of his route, checking for vandalism, drug activity, or homeless encampments that sometimes formed in abandoned commercial properties. The parking lot was usually completely empty at this hour, which was why the lone vehicle immediately caught his attention. As Coleman pulled his patrol car behind the Impala and activated his emergency lights, he noticed several things that seemed unusual. The car was positioned perfectly within the parking lines, as if the driver had been particularly careful about proper parking. The vehicle appeared to be in excellent condition. No damage, clean paint, and relatively new tires. Coleman approached the driver's side and immediately noticed that the car was empty, but the keys were hanging from the ignition. When he tested the key, the Impala started immediately with no mechanical issues. The fuel gauge showed nearly a full tank, and all electrical systems appeared to be functioning normally. Coleman ran the license plate through the police database. California. Plate 8 GHK 542, registered to Detective Marcus Reynolds of the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. The registration was current, and when Coleman ran Reynolds' name through the law enforcement database, he found an active missing person report filed just 18 hours earlier. This immediately elevated the situation from a routine abandoned vehicle to a potential emergency involving a fellow law enforcement officer. Coleman radioed for his supervisor, Sergeant Patricia Hayes, and requested that dispatch contact the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department for more information about Detective Reynolds' disappearance. While waiting for backup, Coleman began a more thorough examination of the vehicle and discovered the first in a series of disturbing details that would transform this into something far more sinister than a missing officer case. On the front passenger seat was Detective Reynolds' service weapon, a Glock 22 in its holster, positioned carefully in the center of the seat. Next to the weapon was Reynolds' badge and identification, along with what appeared to be a case file folder marked Confidential Internal Investigation. Coleman photographed everything before disturbing the scene, following protocol for potentially serious crimes involving law enforcement personnel. The careful positioning of Reynolds' badge and weapon on the passenger seat suggested they had been deliberately placed there rather than forgotten or hastily abandoned. When Coleman opened the case file, he found documents that made him immediately call for Detective Amanda Russell, the department's senior investigator. The file contained internal affairs, investigation reports documenting corruption allegations against multiple officers in the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, including Detective Reynolds himself. According to the documents, Reynolds had been under investigation for evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and possible involvement in drug trafficking through his position in the narcotics division. More disturbing were handwritten notes in Reynolds' writing that suggested he had been gathering evidence against his fellow officers in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Sergeant Hayes arrived at the scene 20 minutes after Coleman's call, accompanied by Detective Russell. As Coleman briefed them on what he had found, Russell immediately recognized the significance of finding a potentially corrupt detective's vehicle with his service weapon and sensitive internal affairs documents deliberately positioned for discovery. "This isn't an abandoned vehicle," Russell told Coleman and Hayes as she examined the scene. "This is either a crime scene or someone wanted us to think it was a crime scene. Either way, we're dealing with something that involves a police corruption and a missing officer who was apparently cooperating with internal investigators." Russell decided to expand the search beyond the immediate area around Reynolds' vehicle. The abandoned shopping center covered approximately 10 acres, with multiple buildings, loading docks, and service areas where evidence might be hidden or where Reynolds himself might be found. Using high-powered flashlights, the officers began a systematic search of the property. Behind the old department store, they discovered a service entrance that had been recently forced open. The door showed fresh pry marks, and the lock mechanism had been completely destroyed. Inside the abandoned store, Russell found evidence that someone had been using the space recently. In what had once been the store's management office, there were signs of recent occupation: food containers, water bottles, and what appeared to be surveillance equipment including cameras and recording devices. Most disturbing was what Russell found in the store's former security office. The walls were covered with photographs of various police officers, all apparently taken without their knowledge. The photos showed officers at work, at home, and in social situations, suggesting extensive surveillance of multiple law enforcement personnel. Among the photographs, Russell found pictures of Detective Reynolds taken over what appeared to be several weeks. The photos showed Reynolds at his home, arriving at work, meeting with people in various locations, and in some cases, engaging in activities that appeared to be evidence exchanges or clandestine meetings. But it was the final set of photographs that made Russell call for the FBI. Pinned to the center of the wall was a series of pictures showing Reynolds being forcibly brought into the abandoned shopping center by two unidentified men. The photos were time-stamped, indicating they had been taken just 6 hours before Coleman discovered Reynolds' abandoned car. Russell realized they were dealing with a situation that went far beyond a missing police officer. The evidence suggested that Reynolds had been abducted by people who had been conducting extensive surveillance of law enforcement personnel, possibly in connection with the corruption investigation he had been involved in. The FBI's involvement brought Special Agent Tyler Mitchell to the scene. Mitchell specialized in crimes against law enforcement and public corruption cases. As he reviewed the evidence Russell had discovered, he recognized patterns consistent with what the Bureau called police cleaning operations, systematic elimination of law enforcement personnel who posed threats to criminal organizations. What you found here suggests that Detective Reynolds wasn't just investigating corruption in his department, Mitchell explained to the local officers. He was apparently being hunted by people who had the resources and knowledge to conduct sophisticated surveillance of multiple police officers. Agent Mitchell's team began processing the abandoned store as a major crime scene. Forensic specialists found evidence that the location had been used as a base of operations for several months, with sophisticated surveillance equipment, detailed files on numerous law enforcement personnel, and what appeared to be planning documents for multiple operations targeting police officers. The surveillance equipment found in the store included devices capable of intercepting police radio communications, monitoring cell phone conversations, and tracking the movements of vehicles equipped with police GPS systems. The sophistication of the equipment suggested that whoever had been operating from this location had extensive knowledge of law enforcement procedures and technology. Most disturbing were the detailed files found in the store's former stockroom. These files contained personal information about over 40 police officers from departments across California, Nevada, and Oregon. Each file included home addresses, family information, work schedules, and detailed assessments of each officer's potential vulnerability to corruption or elimination. Detective Reynolds' file was among the most extensive, documenting his involvement in the internal affairs investigation and his decision to cooperate with investigators in exchange for immunity. The file also contained what appeared to be transcripts of Reynolds' conversations with internal affairs investigators, suggesting that someone within law enforcement had been providing information to the people operating from the abandoned store. Agent Mitchell realized that Reynolds' abduction was part of a much larger operation targeting law enforcement personnel who posed threats to an organized criminal network. The network had been using the abandoned shopping center as a base for surveilling and planning operations against police officers across multiple states. The search for Detective Reynolds expanded to include properties throughout the region that might be connected to the criminal network. Meanwhile, the FBI began an investigation into how the network had obtained access to confidential internal affairs, information, and police communications. As dawn broke on November 19th, Officer Coleman's routine check of an abandoned vehicle had revealed a criminal operation that threatened law enforcement personnel across multiple states. The black Impala in the empty parking lot had been left as evidence of a crime that was far more extensive and dangerous than anyone had initially imagined. Detective Reynolds remained missing, but the evidence found at the abandoned shopping center suggested that his abduction was connected to a network that had been systematically targeting police officers involved in corruption investigations. The case would ultimately expose vulnerabilities in law enforcement that criminal organizations had been exploiting for months. Agent Mitchell's investigation into Detective Reynolds' abduction revealed that the criminal network operating from the abandoned shopping center had been systematically infiltrating law enforcement agencies across the western United States for over 2 years. The sophisticated surveillance operation discovered by Detective Russell was just one component of what the FBI would later classify as the most extensive anti-law enforcement conspiracy in modern American history. The breakthrough came when FBI forensic specialists analyzing the surveillance equipment found in the abandoned store discovered that the devices had been used to intercept communications from multiple police departments simultaneously. The network had been monitoring radio traffic, cell phone conversations, and even internal computer networks from dozens of law enforcement agencies. More disturbing was the discovery that the network had developed detailed psychological profiles of hundreds of police officers, identifying those who were most likely to be susceptible to corruption, intimidation, or elimination. Detective Reynolds had been classified as a Category A threat because of his cooperation with internal affairs investigators and his detailed knowledge of corruption within his department. Agent Mitchell's team found evidence that the network had successfully targeted at least 12 other police officers over the past 18 months. Some had been corrupted and were providing information to criminal organizations. Others had been intimidated into silence about crimes they had witnessed. And some, like Detective Reynolds, had simply disappeared. The investigation revealed that the network's operations were coordinated by someone with extensive law enforcement experience, who understood police procedures, investigation techniques, and the vulnerabilities inherent in law enforcement agencies. The person directing these operations knew exactly how to exploit the gaps in interagency communication and the reluctance of officers to report suspicious activities involving their colleagues. Officer Coleman, whose discovery of Reynolds' abandoned car had initiated the investigation, found himself assigned to a joint task force focused on identifying other potential targets within his own department. The realization that criminal organizations were actively hunting police officers created an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion that affected every aspect of law enforcement operations. "We started looking at each other differently," Coleman later reflected. Every conversation, every piece of information shared, every decision made had to be evaluated for the possibility that someone was feeding intelligence to people who wanted to hurt us. The search for Detective Reynolds led FBI agents to a remote facility in the Nevada desert, where they discovered evidence of what could only be described as a systematic torture and elimination program targeting law enforcement personnel. The facility contained holding cells designed specifically for police officers, along with interrogation rooms equipped with recording equipment. When federal agents raided the Nevada facility, they found Detective Reynolds alive but in critical condition. He had been subjected to weeks of psychological and physical torture, designed to extract information about ongoing investigations and the identities of other officers who might pose threats to criminal networks. Reynolds' condition when found revealed the full extent of the network's sophisticated approach to eliminating law enforcement threats. He had been systematically broken down through techniques that combined physical torture with psychological manipulation, specifically designed to target the mental resilience that police training was meant to develop. They knew exactly how to attack the psychological foundations of police training. Dr. Amanda Harris, the FBI psychologist who treated Reynolds, explained to the task force. They understood that police officers are trained to maintain control and protect others, so they created scenarios where Reynolds was completely helpless and forced to watch recordings of his colleagues being threatened. The recordings found at the Nevada facility showed that the network had been surveilling and threatening the families of police officers as part of their psychological torture program. Reynolds had been shown videos of his own children being followed to school and his wife being monitored at her workplace, reinforcing his complete helplessness to protect those he cared about. More disturbing were recordings of other police officers who had been held at the facility. The network had documented the systematic breakdown of at least 8 other law enforcement personnel, creating what amounted to training materials for torturing police officers effectively. Agent Mitchell's investigation revealed that the network's ultimate goal wasn't just eliminating individual threats, but creating a climate of fear within law enforcement that would prevent officers from effectively investigating organized crime activities. By demonstrating that they could successfully hunt, capture, and torture police officers, the network was attempting to make law enforcement personnel afraid to pursue certain types of investigations. The network had also been using the information extracted from tortured officers to compromise ongoing investigations and identify confidential informants. Several major drug trafficking and organized crime cases had been compromised because the network had obtained detailed information about investigative techniques and personnel involved. Detective Russell, who had discovered the initial evidence at the abandoned shopping center, found herself assigned to a specialized unit focused on investigating corruption within law enforcement agencies that might be connected to the network. Her investigation revealed that the network had successfully placed informants within police departments, sheriff's offices, and even federal agencies. The most terrifying aspect of this case, Russell told a law enforcement conference months later, was realizing that people we worked with every day, people we trusted with our lives, might be providing information to organizations that wanted to torture and kill us. The investigation into the network's law enforcement connections led to the arrest of 17 police officers, 6 sheriff's deputies, and 3 federal agents who had been providing information in exchange for money or protection from the network's elimination program. These arrests created a crisis of confidence in law enforcement that extended far beyond the agencies directly involved. Officer Coleman found that his routine abandoned vehicle discovery had ultimately led to the exposure of corruption that reached into the highest levels of law enforcement in multiple states. The black Impala in the abandoned shopping center parking lot had been the first visible evidence of a conspiracy that threatened the fundamental integrity of police work. The network's leaders, when finally arrested, showed no remorse for their systematic torture and murder of police officers. They maintained that law enforcement had become a threat to their business operations, and that eliminating or controlling police personnel was simply a necessary business expense. During interrogations, the network's director, a former police captain named Austin Reed, who had been dismissed from the Los Angeles Police Department 8 years earlier, explained the organization's methodology with clinical detachment. Police officers are trained to be predictable, Reed told Agent Mitchell during his confession. They follow procedures, they trust their colleagues, and they believe in the system they serve. All of these characteristics make them easy to manipulate and ultimately eliminate when they become inconvenient. Reed's network had developed what he called law enforcement elimination protocols that could be applied to any police department in the country. The protocols involved systematic surveillance, psychological profiling, infiltration of communication networks, and ultimately, the capture and torture of officers who posed specific threats. The case against Reed and his network revealed that they had been responsible for the disappearances of over 30 law enforcement personnel across 7 states over a 3-year period. Most of these disappearances had been classified as voluntary departures or accidents, allowing the network to operate without detection for an extended period. Detective Reynolds, despite his survival, was permanently disabled by the psychological trauma he had endured. He was medically retired from law enforcement and required ongoing psychiatric treatment for complex post-traumatic stress disorder related to his torture and the systematic destruction of his sense of safety and professional identity. The Reynolds case led to fundamental changes in how law enforcement agencies approach officer safety and information security. New protocols were established for protecting the identities of officers involved in sensitive investigations, and specialized units were created to investigate threats specifically targeting law enforcement personnel. Officer Coleman, whose careful attention to an abandoned vehicle had initiated the investigation that exposed Reed's network, was promoted to detective and assigned to the new anti-law enforcement crime unit. He often reflects on how a routine call had revealed a conspiracy that most police officers never imagined could exist. "We're trained to think about external threats, criminals we're investigating, dangerous situations we respond to," Coleman explains to new officers during training sessions. "But this case taught us that some of the most dangerous threats come from people who understand exactly how we think and how we operate, and who use that knowledge against us." The abandoned shopping center where Reed's network had operated was demolished 6 months after the investigation concluded, but the site remains under federal surveillance as investigators continue to search for additional evidence and potential victims. The case demonstrated that criminal organizations had evolved to specifically target law enforcement as a strategic priority, transforming routine police work into a potentially deadly profession in ways that traditional training had never anticipated. The investigation into Austin Reed's anti-law enforcement network took a horrific turn when FBI forensic specialists discovered evidence that the organization had been specifically recruiting former police officers who harbored resentment against their former departments. Agent Mitchell's team found personnel files showing that Reed had systematically targeted ex-officers who had been dismissed for misconduct, passed over for promotion, or forced into early retirement. These former officers brought intimate knowledge of police procedures, investigation techniques, and the psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited in law enforcement personnel. More disturbing, they knew exactly how to manipulate the trust and brotherhood that existed within police departments to gain access to sensitive information and identify vulnerable targets. Detective Russell's investigation into the network's membership revealed names that sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the western United States. Among Reed's inner circle was former Detective Kyle Morrison, who had been dismissed from the Portland Police Bureau 3 years earlier for evidence tampering. Morrison had intimate knowledge of Officer Coleman's department and had specifically recommended Detective Reynolds as a high-priority target. "The people hunting us weren't just criminals," Agent Mitchell explained to the Joint Task Force. "They were people who had worn the same badge we wear, who understood our procedures better than we understood them ourselves, and who had turned that knowledge into a weapon against law enforcement." The discovery of Morrison's involvement led to the realization that Reed's network had been infiltrating police departments not just through surveillance and corruption, but by placing former officers in positions where they could observe and report on current law enforcement activities. Morrison had been working as a security consultant for several private companies that contracted with police departments, giving him access to facilities, personnel, and operational information. But Morrison's role went far deeper than simple intelligence gathering. Agent Mitchell's team discovered that Morrison had been specifically tasked with identifying what Reed called high-value targets, police officers whose elimination would have maximum impact on law enforcement operations while appearing to be routine disappearances or voluntary departures. Morrison's method was disturbingly systematic. He would study personnel files, performance evaluations, and case assignments to identify officers who possessed critical knowledge about ongoing investigations, had access to sensitive intelligence, or were involved in internal affairs, investigations that threatened corrupt officers within police departments. Agent Mitchell's team discovered that Morrison had been systematically gathering intelligence on police officers throughout Oregon and California, creating detailed profiles that Reed's network used to identify targets for corruption, intimidation, or elimination. The profiles included personal information about officers' families, financial situations, psychological assessments, and detailed analyses of each officer's potential value as a target. Officer Coleman found his own name in Morrison's files, along with assessments of his patrol routes, response patterns, and personal vulnerabilities. The file noted that Coleman was methodical and observant, but potentially useful as an unwitting intelligence asset due to his regular contact with crime scenes and evidence. More disturbing, Morrison had documented Coleman's work schedule, home address, family members, and even the route he took to work each day. Reading that file was like having someone dissect your entire professional life, Coleman later told Internal Affairs investigators. They knew things about my work habits that I didn't even realize I had, and they were planning to use that knowledge against me and my fellow officers. The Morrison file contained detailed psychological assessments of over 200 police officers from Coleman's department alone. Each assessment included recommendations for how the officer could be approached for recruitment as an informant, targeted for elimination, or manipulated to provide intelligence without their knowledge. Morrison had identified Officer Coleman as someone who could be leveraged through family pressure due to his close relationship with his elderly parents and his concern for their safety. The file contained photographs of Coleman's parents, their daily routines, medical appointments, and even the security systems at their home. The investigation revealed that Reed's network had been responsible for the disappearances of far more law enforcement personnel than initially suspected. Cross-referencing missing officer reports with the network's target files, Agent Mitchell identified 37 police officers, sheriff's deputies, and federal agents who had vanished over the past 4 years under circumstances that had been initially attributed to voluntary departures or accidents. Each disappearance had been carefully planned to avoid suspicion. Officers with family problems were made to appear to have left voluntarily to escape personal difficulties. Officers with financial troubles were made to appear to have fled to avoid debt obligations. Officers with health issues were made to appear to have suffered accidents or medical emergencies. Most of these officers had been involved in investigations that threatened organized crime operations, or had been identified as potential witnesses in corruption cases. Reed's network had been systematically eliminating law enforcement personnel who posed threats to criminal organizations, while making their disappearances appear to be routine personnel matters rather than murders. Detective Russell discovered that the network's method for eliminating police officers was particularly sophisticated. Instead of simply murdering targets, they would stage elaborate scenarios designed to make the officers appear to have abandoned their duties, committed crimes, or suffered accidents. This approach served multiple purposes. It eliminated the threat posed by the officer, discredited them professionally, and demoralized their colleagues. The Nevada facility, where Detective Reynolds had been held, was just one of several locations where the network conducted what they called law enforcement processing. FBI raids on 3 additional facilities in California, Arizona, and Colorado revealed holding areas specifically designed for police officers, with restraint systems that accounted for law enforcement training in escape and resistance techniques. These facilities contained evidence of systematic torture programs that had been refined over years of experience with law enforcement personnel. The network had developed specific techniques for breaking down the psychological resilience that police training was meant to instill, using officers' protective instincts and sense of duty against them. The facilities were designed like professional interrogation centers, but with modifications that specifically targeted police psychology. Each holding cell contained surveillance equipment that allowed the network to monitor officers' responses to different types of psychological pressure. The cells were equipped with speakers that could play recordings of the officers' family members being threatened, their colleagues being tortured, or their departments being compromised. Dr. Amanda Harris, the FBI psychologist treating survivors found at these facilities, described the network's methods as representing the most sophisticated understanding of law enforcement psychology she had encountered outside of official training programs. They had studied police officers like laboratory subjects, Dr. Harris explained to Agent Mitchell's team. They understood exactly how to exploit the characteristics that make someone effective in law enforcement: the need to protect others, the sense of duty, the willingness to sacrifice for the greater good, and turn those strengths into vulnerabilities. The network had developed what they called police-specific torture protocols that were designed to break down law enforcement personnel more efficiently than traditional torture methods. These protocols exploited officers' training in resistance techniques by using their own training against them, creating scenarios where their resistance actually increased their suffering. The survivors found at Reed's facilities provided testimony that revealed the full extent of the network's anti-law enforcement operations. Officers had been forced to watch recordings of their colleagues being tortured, their families being threatened, and their departments being compromised through information extracted from previous victims. The psychological impact on the surviving officers was severe and lasting. Unlike civilian torture victims, these officers had been specifically targeted because of their profession, creating a sense that their chosen career had made them and their families vulnerable to systematic persecution. Detective Russell interviewed Sergeant Jessica Williams, a 15-year veteran of the San Francisco Police Department who had been held at the Nevada facility for 6 weeks before the FBI raid. Williams described how the network had used her knowledge of police procedures against her during interrogation sessions. They knew exactly how we're trained to resist interrogation, Williams told Russell during her debrief. But they also knew how to exploit the fact that we're trained to protect others above ourselves. They would show me videos of my partner being tortured in another room, and they knew that I would break down faster to stop his suffering than I ever would to stop my own. The network had also been using tortured officers to create what they called law enforcement intelligence databases, containing detailed information about ongoing investigations, informant networks, and interagency cooperation efforts. This information was being sold to criminal organizations across the country, allowing them to stay ahead of law enforcement efforts and eliminate threats before they could develop. Agent Mitchell's team discovered that the network had compiled databases containing operational details about hundreds of law enforcement agencies, including investigation techniques, personnel assignments, informant identities, and planned operations. This intelligence was being distributed to criminal organizations for fees ranging from $10,000 to $100,000, depending on the sensitivity and scope of the information. Detective Russell discovered that her own department had been compromised when she found evidence that the network had detailed information about internal investigations, personnel assignments, and operational plans that should have been known only to senior command staff. The realization that someone within her department was feeding information to people who tortured and killed police officers created a crisis of trust that affected every aspect of the department's operations. "We started questioning everything," Russell told a law enforcement conference months later. Every briefing, every assignment, every piece of intelligence had to be evaluated for the possibility that it would be used against us. We were afraid of our own information systems. The investigation revealed that Reed's network had successfully placed informants in over 40 law enforcement agencies across 7 states. These informants, many of whom were current or former officers, had been recruited through a combination of financial incentives, blackmail, and threats against their families. Some informants had been providing information willingly in exchange for money or protection from prosecution for misconduct. Others had been coerced into cooperation after being presented with evidence of minor infractions or personal problems that could damage their careers. The network had been particularly successful at exploiting officers who were struggling with debt, marital problems, or substance abuse issues. The recruitment process used by Reed's network was sophisticated and systematic. They would identify vulnerable officers through financial records, personnel files, and behavioral observations, then approach them gradually with offers of assistance or support. Once an officer accepted any form of help from the network, they would be gradually drawn into providing information in exchange for continued support. Agent Mitchell's team discovered that the network maintained detailed psychological profiles on thousands of law enforcement personnel, rating each officer's potential vulnerability to recruitment or elimination. The profiles included information gathered from social media surveillance, financial records, family background checks, and even medical records obtained through various illegal means. Officer Coleman's profile had rated him as low recruitment potential, but high intelligence value due to his methodical approach to crime scene investigation and his regular contact with evidence that could be valuable to criminal organizations. The network had been planning to eliminate Coleman after using him to gather intelligence about ongoing investigations in his department. The profile system was so detailed that it included assessments of officers' personalities, work habits, family relationships, and potential psychological triggers that could be used for manipulation. Each profile contained recommendations for the most effective methods to approach, recruit, or eliminate the individual officer. The scope of Reed's anti-law enforcement conspiracy became clear when Agent Mitchell's team discovered that the network had been coordinating with criminal organizations across the country to share intelligence about police operations and eliminate law enforcement threats systematically. The network served as a specialized service provider to organized crime, offering surveillance, intelligence gathering, and elimination services targeted specifically at law enforcement personnel. Reed's organization had essentially created an industry focused on hunting police officers, with specialized techniques, equipment, and personnel dedicated to neutralizing law enforcement threats to criminal operations. The network's success had encouraged similar organizations to develop in other regions, creating what federal investigators described as a law enforcement elimination economy. The financial records seized from Reed's network showed that they had generated over $15 million in revenue over 4 years by providing anti-law enforcement services to criminal organizations. The network charged different rates for different services. Intelligence gathering cost $5,000 to $25,000 per target, depending on the officer's rank and access to sensitive information. Corruption or recruitment services cost $50,000 to $200,000 per officer. Elimination services cost $500,000 to $1 million per target, depending on the officer's profile and the complexity required to make their disappearance appear routine. The investigation revealed that Reed's network had been expanding rapidly, with plans to establish operations in additional states and to develop international connections with similar organizations in other countries. The network's business plan, found in Reed's personal files, projected revenue growth of 300% over the next 5 years, based on expanding demand for anti-law enforcement services from organized crime groups. The full horror of Reed's anti-law enforcement network was revealed when federal investigators discovered that the organization had been operating what they called police hunting preserves, remote facilities where law enforcement personnel were held, tortured, and ultimately murdered for the entertainment of clients who paid premium prices to watch the systematic destruction of police officers. Agent Mitchell's team found evidence that the network had been selling access to live-streamed torture sessions featuring captured police officers to buyers around the world. The sessions were marketed to individuals with specific interests in seeing law enforcement personnel reduced to helpless victims through systematic psychological and physical torture. The discovery of this law enforcement snuff market added international dimensions to the case and revealed that Reed's network was part of a global industry focused on the exploitation and murder of police officers for profit and entertainment. Detective Russell's investigation into the network's financial records showed that individual torture sessions featuring police officers were being sold for amounts ranging from $50,000 to $200,000, depending on the victim's rank, experience, and the duration of the torture program. The network had generated over $3 million in revenue from these sessions over the past 2 years. The torture facilities were equipped with professional-grade streaming equipment, multiple camera angles, and sophisticated audio systems that allowed clients to hear every sound made by the victims. The facilities were designed to maximize the psychological impact of the torture while providing optimal viewing experiences for paying clients. Most disturbing was the discovery that some of the network's clients were individuals with connections to law enforcement agencies, including retired officers, police commissioners, and even federal agents who had developed sadistic interests in watching their former colleagues being systematically destroyed. Agent Mitchell's team found client databases containing over 300 names from around the world, including law enforcement personnel from the United States, Europe, and Australia. The international scope of the client base suggested that the market for police torture entertainment was much larger than anyone had imagined. The client list found in Reed's files included names that sent shockwaves through law enforcement leadership across multiple agencies. Among the buyers were individuals who had access to sensitive law enforcement information and who had been using that access to help Reed's network identify and target specific officers for capture and torture. Detective Chief Patricia Williams of the Los Angeles Police Department was among those named as clients who had purchased access to torture sessions featuring officers from her own department. Williams had been using her position to provide Reed's network with intelligence about officers who were involved in internal affairs, investigations, or who posed potential threats to corruption networks within the LAPD. Officer Coleman found himself dealing with the psychological impact of knowing that people within law enforcement had been paying to watch police officers being tortured and murdered. The realization that some of the people he had worked with or looked up to were consumers of police torture entertainment created a lasting trauma that affected his ability to trust anyone within the law enforcement community. The worst part wasn't just knowing that criminals were hunting us, Coleman told Dr. Harris during his mandatory psychological evaluation. It was finding out that some of the people we thought were on our side were actually paying to watch us suffer. It makes you question everything about who you can trust and what this job really means. The investigation into the client network revealed that many of the buyers were individuals who had been rejected by law enforcement agencies, dismissed from police departments, or who harbored personal resentments against law enforcement. The torture sessions provided them with vicarious revenge against the institution that had rejected them. However, the most disturbing discovery was that approximately 30% of the clients were active or retired law enforcement personnel who had developed what FBI psychologists described as institutional sadism, a psychological condition in which individuals in positions of authority develop enjoyment from watching others in similar positions being systematically destroyed. Agent Mitchell's team found evidence that some clients had been providing suggestions for specific torture techniques or requesting that certain types of officers be targeted for capture. The network had developed a custom service where clients could request that specific officers be captured and subjected to particular types of torture programs designed to satisfy the client's specific interests. The investigation revealed that Reed's network had been planning to expand their operations significantly, with proposals to establish police hunting reserves in rural areas where captured officers could be held for extended periods and subjected to increasingly elaborate torture programs for paying clients. The network's business plan, found in Reed's personal files, outlined methods for capturing entire police units during staged emergencies, allowing clients to observe the systematic breakdown of police teamwork and command structures under extreme stress. The plan included detailed cost analyses for different types of torture programs and projected revenue growth based on expanding their client base internationally. One particularly disturbing aspect of the business plan was the proposal to create police breeding programs, where officers would be held long-term and forced to produce children who would be raised in captivity and eventually tortured as entertainment for clients interested in second-generation law enforcement victims. Agent Mitchell's team discovered that Reed had been in negotiations with similar networks in Europe and Asia to share techniques and coordinate international operations targeting law enforcement personnel globally. The network was working toward creating a worldwide industry focused on the systematic exploitation of police officers for profit. The international connections revealed that police torture entertainment had become a global market, with networks in multiple countries sharing techniques, client lists, and even victims through international trafficking operations. Reed's network had been both selling content to international clients and purchasing content from similar operations in other countries. The investigation expanded to include Interpol and law enforcement agencies in 12 countries, where evidence suggested similar networks were operating. The global scope of the industry revealed that law enforcement personnel worldwide were being systematically targeted by organizations that viewed police officers as a specialized form of entertainment commodity. The psychological evaluations of Reed and his inner circle revealed individuals who had developed an intense hatred of law enforcement that went far beyond simple criminal opposition to police work. They viewed police officers as representatives of a system that had rejected them, and their torture and murder of law enforcement personnel was driven by a desire for revenge against the entire institution of policing. Reed, during his psychological evaluation, showed no remorse for the torture and murder of police officers, instead expressing satisfaction that he had been able to show them what it feels like to be helpless and abandoned by the system they served. His psychological profile described him as suffering from narcissistic personality disorder combined with sadistic tendencies that had been exacerbated by his dismissal from law enforcement. The evaluation noted that Reed's intelligence and law enforcement background had allowed him to create one of the most sophisticated revenge fantasies ever documented in criminal psychology. The psychological evaluation also revealed that Reed had been planning even more elaborate torture programs, including scenarios where police officers would be forced to torture their own colleagues while being recorded for client entertainment. Reed's vision included creating a police torture university, where captured officers would be systematically broken down and then forced to participate in breaking down newly captured officers. The network's other members showed similar psychological profiles, with most being former law enforcement personnel who had developed intense resentment toward their former colleagues and departments. Their intimate knowledge of police psychology and procedures had been weaponized through their psychological disorders to create systematic torture programs specifically designed to cause maximum suffering to law enforcement personnel. Kyle Morrison, Reed's second-in-command, had developed what psychologists described as a police persecution complex, in which he believed that law enforcement as an institution was fundamentally corrupt, and that police officers deserved to be systematically eliminated as a service to society. Morrison had convinced himself that the torture and murder of police officers was a form of public service that would ultimately benefit communities by eliminating what he saw as an oppressive force. The trial of Reed and his network members revealed details about their operations that were so disturbing that much of the testimony was sealed to protect the families of victims and to prevent copycat operations from developing. The evidence presented included recordings of torture sessions, detailed torture protocols, and financial records showing the scope of the network's operations. The trial lasted 8 months and included testimony from over 200 witnesses, including surviving torture victims, family members of murdered officers, and law enforcement personnel who had been targeted by the network. The psychological impact on everyone involved in the trial was severe, with multiple jurors requiring counseling and several attorneys requesting transfers to other cases. Reed was convicted of 37 counts of first-degree murder, along with numerous charges related to torture, conspiracy, racketeering, and international trafficking. He was sentenced to death, becoming the first person in federal history to receive the death penalty, specifically for systematic torture and murder of law enforcement personnel. During his sentencing hearing, Reed addressed the court with a statement that chilled everyone present. "You can kill me, but you can't kill the idea. There are others who share my vision of a world where police officers understand what it feels like to be truly helpless. The work will continue with or without me." The other network members received sentences ranging from life imprisonment without parole to death, depending on their level of involvement in the torture and murder operations. Several former police officers who had provided intelligence to the network received sentences of 25 years to life for their betrayal of their colleagues. Kyle Morrison was sentenced to life without parole and showed no remorse during his sentencing hearing. He told the judge, "Every police officer who dies at our hands represents justice for the communities they oppressed. We provided a service that society needs but is too cowardly to acknowledge." The international clients who had purchased access to the torture sessions faced varying legal consequences depending on the jurisdiction where they resided. Several retired law enforcement officials in the United States were charged with conspiracy and received sentences of 10 to 20 years. International clients faced similar charges in their home countries, leading to arrests and prosecutions across multiple continents. Detective Reynolds, despite surviving his ordeal, was never able to return to law enforcement. The psychological trauma he had endured left him unable to function in any capacity that involved law enforcement work, and he required ongoing psychiatric treatment for severe post-traumatic stress disorder and survivor's guilt related to the officers who had died in captivity. Reynolds' testimony during the trial provided the most detailed account of the network's torture methods and their psychological impact on law enforcement personnel. His description of being forced to watch recordings of his colleagues being tortured while being told that his family would be next if he didn't cooperate provided crucial evidence for the prosecution. "They didn't just want to kill us," Reynolds told the court during his testimony. "They wanted to destroy everything that made us police officers: our sense of duty, our willingness to protect others, our faith in the system we served. They wanted to turn us into broken, helpless victims who would serve as entertainment for people who enjoyed watching police officers suffer." Officer Coleman was promoted to detective and assigned to a new federal task force focused on investigating threats to law enforcement personnel. His discovery of Reed's network led to fundamental changes in how police departments approach officer safety and threat assessment. The Reed case taught us that we had been thinking about officer safety all wrong, Coleman explained to a congressional hearing on law enforcement security. "We prepared for threats from the criminals we were investigating, but we never imagined that someone would create an entire industry focused on hunting police officers specifically because they were police officers." Coleman's work with the federal task force led to the identification of 3 additional networks that had been inspired by Reed's operation. The task force's investigations prevented these networks from reaching operational status and resulted in the arrest of over 50 individuals who had been planning similar operations targeting law enforcement personnel. Detective Russell became the head of a new FBI unit focused on investigating organized threats to law enforcement, with particular emphasis on identifying former law enforcement personnel who might pose threats to their former colleagues. Her work has led to the prevention of several similar networks from developing to the operational level. Russell's unit developed new protocols for monitoring former law enforcement personnel who had been dismissed for misconduct or who had expressed hostility toward their former agencies. The protocols included psychological evaluations, financial monitoring, and surveillance of online activities to identify individuals who might be planning operations against law enforcement personnel. The abandoned shopping center where Coleman had first discovered evidence of Reed's network was converted into a memorial for law enforcement personnel killed in the line of duty, with a special section dedicated to the officers who died at the hands of Reed's organization. The memorial serves as a reminder that police officers face threats not just from criminals, but from people who understand law enforcement well enough to exploit its vulnerabilities. Agent Mitchell continues to investigate similar networks and has identified evidence suggesting that Reed's organization was part of a larger trend toward systematic targeting of law enforcement personnel by organized criminal groups. His unit has documented at least 12 other operations that appear to have been inspired by or modeled after Reed's network. The case fundamentally changed how law enforcement agencies approach internal security, with new protocols for background investigations, ongoing psychological evaluations, and threat assessment procedures designed to identify potential insider threats before they can cause damage to operations or personnel. Perhaps most significantly, the case led to the recognition that law enforcement personnel require protection, not just from external criminal threats, but from people within their own community who have developed homicidal resentment toward the institution of policing itself. The international law enforcement community established new protocols for sharing intelligence about threats to police personnel, recognizing that the market for police torture entertainment was a global phenomenon that required coordinated response efforts across multiple countries. Officer Coleman's routine check of an abandoned vehicle had ultimately revealed that police officers were being systematically hunted by people who understood law enforcement better than the officers themselves understood the threats they faced. The black Impala in the empty parking lot had been the first visible evidence of a conspiracy that treated police officers not as guardians of public safety, but as prey in an elaborate hunting operation designed to satisfy the sadistic impulses of people who had turned their knowledge of law enforcement into a weapon against the officers who had once been their colleagues. Today, when police officers across the country conduct routine abandoned vehicle investigations, they are trained to recognize that sometimes the most dangerous discoveries are those that appear to be routine. Coleman's experience serves as a permanent reminder that in law enforcement, the most innocent-seeming situations can reveal horrors that most officers never imagined they might encounter, and that the greatest threats sometimes come from people who know exactly how police officers think and how they can be manipulated, captured, and destroyed. The legacy of Reed's network continues to haunt law enforcement agencies worldwide. Despite the arrests and prosecutions, investigators have found evidence that similar operations continue to develop in other regions, suggesting that the systematic targeting of police officers has become a permanent feature of organized crime operations. The psychological impact on law enforcement personnel has been lasting and severe. Many officers report feeling vulnerable in ways they never experienced before, knowing that their profession itself makes them targets for systematic persecution by people who understand their training, their procedures, and their psychological vulnerabilities better than they understand them themselves. As Agent Mitchell noted in his final report on the case, Reed's network demonstrated that police officers face a new category of threat that we were never trained to recognize or defend against. The people hunting us aren't just criminals. They're people who understand law enforcement as well as we do, and who have weaponized that knowledge against us. This represents a fundamental change in the nature of police work that we're still learning to address. The case serves as a permanent reminder that law enforcement officers, in their dedication to protecting others, have created vulnerabilities that sophisticated criminals can exploit. The trust, brotherhood, and sense of duty that make police officers effective also make them potential victims of people who understand these characteristics well enough to turn them into weapons against the officers themselves, lured and murdered. The realization that some of the people he had worked with or looked up to were consumers of police torture entertainment created a lasting trauma that affected his ability to trust anyone within the law enforcement community. The worst part wasn't just knowing that criminals were hunting us, Coleman told Dr. Harris during his mandatory psychological evaluation. It was finding out that some of the people we thought were on our side were actually paying to watch us suffer. It makes you question everything about who you can trust and what this job really means. The investigation revealed that Reed's network had been planning to expand their operations significantly, with proposals to establish police hunting reserves in rural areas where captured officers could be held for extended periods and subjected to increasingly elaborate torture programs for paying clients. The network's business plan, found in Reed's personal files, outlined methods for capturing entire police units during staged emergencies, allowing clients to observe the systematic breakdown of police teamwork and command structures under extreme stress. The plan included detailed cost analyses for different types of torture programs and projected revenue growth based on expanding their client base internationally. Agent Mitchell's team discovered that Reed had been in negotiations with similar networks in Europe and Asia to share techniques and coordinate international operations, targeting law enforcement personnel globally. The network was working toward creating a worldwide industry, focused on the systematic exploitation of police officers for profit. The psychological evaluations of Reed and his inner circle revealed individuals who had developed an intense hatred of law enforcement that went far beyond simple criminal opposition to police work. They viewed police officers as representatives of a system that had rejected them, and their torture and murder of law enforcement personnel was driven by a desire for revenge against the entire institution of policing. Reed, during his psychological evaluation, showed no remorse for the torture and murder of police officers, instead expressing satisfaction that he had been able to show them what it feels like to be helpless and abandoned by the system they served. Details about their operations that were so disturbing that much of the testimony was sealed to protect the families of victims and to prevent copycat operations from developing. The evidence presented included recordings of torture sessions, detailed torture protocols, and financial records showing the scope of the network's operations. Reed was convicted of 37 counts of first-degree murder, along with numerous charges related to torture, conspiracy, and racketeering. He was sentenced to death, becoming the first person in federal history to receive the death penalty, specifically for systematic torture and murder of law enforcement personnel. The other network members received sentences ranging from life imprisonment without parole to death, depending on their level of involvement in the torture and murder operations. Several former police officers who had provided intelligence to the network received sentences of 25 years to life for their betrayal of their colleagues. Detective Reynolds, despite surviving his ordeal, was never able to return to law enforcement. The psychological trauma he had endured left him unable to function in any capacity that involved law enforcement work, and he required ongoing psychiatric treatment for severe post-traumatic stress disorder and survivors' guilt related to the officers who had died in captivity. Officer Coleman was promoted to detective and assigned to a new federal task force focused on investigating threats to law enforcement personnel. His discovery of Reed's network led to fundamental changes in how police departments approach officer safety and threat assessment. The Reed case taught us that we had been thinking about officer safety all wrong, Coleman explained to a congressional hearing on law enforcement security. We prepared for threats from the criminals we were investigating, but we never imagined that someone would create an entire industry focused on hunting police officers, specifically because they were police officers. Detective Russell became the head of a new FBI unit focused on investigating organized threats to law enforcement, with particular emphasis on identifying former law enforcement personnel who might pose threats to their former colleagues. Her work has led to the prevention of several similar networks from developing to the operational level. The abandoned shopping center where Coleman had first discovered evidence of Reed's network was converted into a memorial for law enforcement personnel killed in the line of duty, with a special section dedicated to the officers who died at the hands of Reed's organization. The memorial serves as a reminder that police officers face threats not just from criminals, but from people who understand law enforcement well enough to exploit its vulnerabilities. Agent Mitchell continues to investigate similar networks and has identified evidence suggesting that Reed's organization was part of a larger trend toward systematic targeting of law enforcement personnel by organized criminal groups. His unit has documented at least 12 other operations that appear to have been inspired by or modeled after Reed's network. The case fundamentally changed how law enforcement agencies approach internal security, with new protocols for background investigations, ongoing psychological evaluations, and threat assessment procedures designed to identify potential insider threats before they can cause damage to operations or personnel. Perhaps most significantly, the case led to the recognition that law enforcement personnel require protection not just from external criminal threats, but from people within their own community who have developed homicidal resentment toward the institution of policing itself. Officer Coleman's routine check of an abandoned vehicle had ultimately revealed that police officers were being systematically hunted by people who understood law enforcement better than the officers themselves understood the threats they faced. The black Impala in the empty parking lot had been the first visible evidence of a conspiracy that treated police officers not as guardians of public safety, but as prey in an elaborate hunting operation designed to satisfy the sadistic impulses of people who had turned their knowledge of law enforcement into a weapon against the officers who had once been their colleagues. Today, when police officers across the country conduct routine abandoned vehicle investigations, they are trained to recognize that sometimes the most dangerous discoveries are those that appear to be routine. Coleman's experience serves as a permanent reminder that in law enforcement, the most innocent-seeming situations can reveal horrors that most officers never imagine they might encounter, and that the greatest threats sometimes come from people who know exactly how police officers think and how they can be manipulated, captured, and destroyed.